First of 6 strikes.
Firefighters and emergency fire control staff from all across the UK have voted 9-1 in favour of industrial action. The first of a series of 6 nationwide strikes will begin at 0900 hours on the 29th of October and will finish at 0900 hours on the 31st of October. Clearly, this is a truly phenomenal vote which shows the enormous depth of feeling that is felt by people who work inside of the operational fire service.
More than 50,000 members of the Fire Brigades Union voted in the ballot. 87% supported industrial action. But the extent of that action has taken some by surprise. 2 48-hour stoppages, followed by a further 4 strikes, each lasting 8 days, and the last one right up to Christmas Eve.
I always expected that because there's no question that the firefighters feel very strongly. We have a great deal of sympathy with them, and that's why we set up an independent review to consider the case, whether they should receive an increase, and if so, what increase it should be.
At the moment, firefighters are paid around £21,500 a year. They believe they should be getting nearer £30,000, which would mean a rise in salary of almost 40%. And while ministers warn a fire strike would be dangerous and damaging, firefighters insist the action could be halted if the government simply sat down and started genuine pay talks.
For any firefighter or control operator, it's not easy walking out that door. That's the hardest thing any of us ever did. That shows you the kind of level of anger among our members that they're actually prepared to go to this line to prove their case. But the government needs to remember this. Once our members have crossed that line and got over that psychological barrier, it's going to be pretty damn hard to get them back in again with a damn good settlement.
The last fire strike in 1977 lasted for 9 weeks, with the Army's Green Goddess fire engines a familiar sight.
We were on strike in 1977.
Firefighters then said the decision to walk out was a tough one.
I was terrified of the consequences, public opinion, the public in general. They paid my wages. That's how difficult it was. It was not an easy decision to take at all.
Kevin's son Lee is also a fireman. He and his colleagues insist that their salary is not enough to live on and doesn't reflect the specialist skills that are now needed to do the job.
When I joined the fire service, I was a single bloke, lived with my parents, and the wages were quite adequate. As I got a little bit older, I got married, bought a house, and it suddenly dawns on you that you're not earning enough money to make ends meet.
The firefighters say that industrial action is their only choice. Their employers warn that the public will be in danger and want more time to negotiate. There is no doubt that firefighters put their own lives on the line. The argument is over how much the job is worth and whether there are funds to meet the pay rise the unions want. Louise Bevan, BBC News.
Final preparations yesterday for this winter's firemen's strike. These soldiers and their ancient Green Goddess fire engines will be the frontline response on strike days. The 1950s Green Goddesses have a maximum speed of 50 miles an hour, even slower around sharp corners, and they have no radio, so they'll have to be accompanied by police cars wherever they go. And when it comes to complex fires, like this one involving gas cylinders and chemicals in Aberdeen last night, the military firemen just don't have the experience. Fire cover in Britain is usually provided by almost 2,300 fire engines and 39,000 firemen. But on strike days, the armed services will only be providing around 830 Green Goddess fire engines and 19,000 firemen and specialist staff. That's 20,000 short of the firemen they're replacing. 10 years ago, there was a huge fire at this chemical warehouse in Bradford. It took 31 fire engines to put it out. The company that now runs the site says it's prepared for a strike, but there are worries.
We have a big resource on site that we think is adequate for our needs, but obviously the concern is that should there be a big incident, we wouldn't have the full professional resources of the firefighting services.
The London Underground says it'll have to close 19 of the deepest stations that have lifts but no escalators. British Energy, that runs our nuclear power stations, hopes to keep them running at full capacity, but it may have to scale down if there's a long-running strike. There are also worries about road and rail accidents. The Army's much less experienced at using the specialist cutting equipment that so often saves lives. Daniel Sandford, BBC News.
Well, let's cross live now to a fire station in Glasgow. Our correspondent there is John Morrison. John, what are the feelings on the ground?
Yes, well, earlier we heard the feelings of the firefighters and the unions, the steely resolve that, yes, they will see this through, although many of them don't want to go on strike. I'm now joined by the firemaster for Strathclyde. It's one of the largest regions in Britain, also in Europe. So
that's right.
What happens now? Does the buck still stop with you?
Well, partially. I mean, obviously, if there is going to be strikes, it's a government assistance to the Strathclyde Fire Board, and we'll have the military in here working alongside the police. Basically, there'll be myself and about 6 other people who'll be advising the military on sifting of fire calls, 999 calls, and attending incidents as half a dozen people can, I mean, and giving advice to the military. It's a tragic situation. I admire the military for what they're doing, but I do fear for what will happen to public safety and military personnel.
But you must be astounded, impressed might be the wrong word, with the turnout and the vote.
Not really. The Fire Brigades Union have a good record of getting their membership into a position, you know, of supporting them, and this is clearly a demonstration of that. Equally, a demonstration of their frustration, and I'm one of the people who thinks a firefighter is worth more money. I just think they should go through the review to achieve that. And I'd make a plea, even at this last hour, if you like, let's go with the review, suspend your action and go with the review.
Now, they have 10 days, there's a window of opportunity. Do you realistically expect this chasm to close?
No, I don't actually, because clearly the union are looking for a 40% increase, and the government and the employers are saying, let's wait and see what the review throws up. But, you know, everybody's got to try, and we've got 10 days to get round the table. But being realistic, I've got to say that the result today makes it look almost more inevitable that a strike will occur, and we are planning for that situation.
Now, in 10 days' time, that fire engine behind you will be in the garage, will remain in the station. We're going to have the Green Goddesses and the army on the road. Experts like yourself, the government, even the Fire Brigade Union have been warning that this will put lives at risk. Just how realistic is this threat?
Well, the threat is greater, there's no doubt about that. If the firefighters go on strike, then the public are at greater risk in case of fire, road traffic accidents, chemical spillages, and the service that the government are providing is just a minimal safety net. It's better than nothing, and that's not being offensive towards the troops. They'll do a terrific job, highly disciplined, good people, but they haven't got the equipment, they haven't got the expertise, but thank goodness they're there. It's better than nothing. But the truth is, a strike will put everyone at risk, the community, the military personnel, and the firefighters themselves. They're going to suffer this grief, and it's unnecessary.
Now, from the sort of management point of view, do you empathise with the men? Do you support their claim that they're worth more than £21,000 a year?
Absolutely, and I've not met a politician or a member of management that doesn't. They're definitely worth more money. It's a question of how much more and for what in return. And I've got confidence the review will deliver that and throw that up. So I'm not able to say how much more that should be, but I've got the confidence in the review to do that.
Now, the union also says that they've already had a review of working operations, as it were, that this should only be about cash. This dispute is about cash. What would you want to see? What changes would you want to see in their working practices?
Well, I'd like to see it include cash and conditions of service, which it's going to, but it's got to look at all the other ways that the fire service operates. The service has not modernised itself for decades. There's been a little bit here and a little bit there. This review, and it is as impartial as you can get, it's got the fabulous opportunity to address the infrastructure of the service and deliver an even better front end and pay firefighters more.
OK, thank you very much.
Thank you.
But in the meantime, the reality is here at this fire station, like every other fire station across Britain, that in 10 days' time, firefighters will be going on strike. Back to you.
Thanks very much indeed. Let us go straight to Westminster. Our political correspondent there is Gitto Harry. Gitto, Nick Rainsford adamant in his position, but do you think that is a line the government can hold in the coming 10 days?
I think they intend to hold it until the review is finished. That's certainly the signals they're giving out in private as well as in public. They think that the outcome of this strike is already conceded. Most strikes lead both sides to the table, where they end up with a third party actually adjudicating. It usually ends up in some kind of a review. On this occasion, the government is adamant the review is there. What is the strike before. They want to wait for the outcome of that review because they think this is about issues beyond pay. They're not going to agree to a huge pay rise without other things being discussed on the table at the same time. Equally, the firefighters, as you've heard, as you've been explaining all afternoon, see this review as a sham, and I can't see how the two sides come together without a lot of grief and suffering in the meantime.
Do you think, though, at all, the government's position is more about keeping a lid on public sector pay than the rights and wrongs of this dispute over the amount it should be with the firefighters?
I think the government is willing to give the firefighters more money than it would give an awful lot of other people. They acknowledge that it's a special case. I think they'd like to offer quite a generous offer, but they're not going to give it in a sort of way that will trigger a whole round of pay demands across the public services. So if they could dress it up in some sort of formula and some sort of package that's agreed through an independent review, then they would do that. What they're not going to do is actually have a confrontation with the trade unions and say, you win, guys, we'll give you 40%. I don't think ministers would ever allow that to happen. And because the firefighters are equally adamant that they're not going to go to this review, it's hard to see what the exit strategy is for the firefighters or the government from this position. It's a very difficult one indeed.
And in terms of the opposition parties, do I assume that they can't be supporting a claim of 40%?
No, they too say that's ridiculous. The Conservatives are essentially pushing for the review as the appropriate vehicle. When we had a big dispute over the summer to do with local government workers, both sides seemed poles apart during that dispute, but they did end up going through some kind of mechanism, some kind of review, and they came up with an outcome, and most people involved in the end were quite happy. On this occasion, because the review is being ruled out, I think it's very hard indeed to see how they can avoid a confrontation, and we will, I think, see quite a few strikes before there'll be a greater willingness perhaps to compromise on both sides.
Gito Harry there at Westminster, thanks very much indeed.
Well, we've been asking this afternoon what you make of the firefighters' dispute. Our Vote 24 question is, do you support firefighters in that campaign for a 40% pay rise? If you do and you believe they're right to strike, then the first number is the one to dial. If you think they have a point when it comes to pay, but they shouldn't actually go out on strike, then dial the second number. If you think no, they simply shouldn't be getting that kind of pay rise, they should accept the 4% they've been offered, then dial the third number. Calls cost a maximum of 10 pence. Let's take a quick look at the way the voting is panning out so far. I think we can show you, anyway, I can tell you, there you go, I can tell you that all day long, people very much supporting the firefighters. More than the best part of 3/4 of you believe that, yes, they have every right to strike. Only 21% of people who've contacted us say they should accept that 4% pay offer.
Now, we want to know your thoughts in all forms, so you can also text us your thoughts or email your thoughts. It's the usual numbers. There's the text messaging number, 07718 24 24 24, and the email address will change there on your screen. There it is. And don't forget to include your name and where you're sending those messages from, and we promise we'll get through plenty more in the next few minutes.
Before that, though, the Indonesian government is due to announce 2 emergency decrees to counter the terrorist threat.
Acrid smoke heralding the most serious challenge yet for service firefighters. We were with the nearest unit, a platoon from the Royal Regiment of Wales, as they turned out of the West Bromwich TA base. Young infantrymen faced with an inferno already out of control and only a month's training to call on. It took over an hour to muster reinforcements from across the city, but despite successfully drawing extra water from the nearby canal, the service crews could never hope to save the building.
We got red fire engines yesterday and today, and those have helped us get on with the job very quickly. Of course, a big ladder that went over the top of the thing might help, but I'm no professional fireman. We're doing our best here.
Twice during the early stages of the blaze, striking firefighters left picket lines to offer their help. On both occasions, they withdrew once they'd established no lives were at risk.
We're now happy that they're safe and we're leaving.
Will you come back if you're needed?
No, not at all.
It's not over yet, but there's considerable relief here that the services appear to have faced their first major test without too many difficulties. The incident has stretched emergency fire cover, though, and over 8 days, crews here and across the UK can expect further challenges to come. Well, over the course of the afternoon, the emphasis has been on trying to save that building on the right-hand side of your picture. They've contained it with the water power, if you like, the number of engines that they had, and they have succeeded in doing that. But, as I indicated in that report, there's a lot of work still to do here. Much of the area has collapsed. There are still fires, deep-seated fires, burning in the warehouse complex, and that still presents risks to the young firefighters. Fiona.
Robert, thanks very much. Well, while the Green Goddess crews tackle emergencies around the country, the political row is raging about who's to blame for the collapse of the talks between the Fire Brigades Union and their employers, the local authorities, early this morning. The union leader, Andy Gilchrist, has accused the government of deliberately scuppering any hope of a deal. But ministers say they won't be held to ransom. Rory Kettlin-Jones has been following events.
9 o'clock and Manchester firefighters walk out. It's the same picture in Newcastle, at Newtown in Powys, in Belfast and across the UK as the picket lines form for the strike they thought had been averted.
Andy, what's changed?
Just 90 minutes earlier, their union leader had blamed the government for scuppering a peace deal.
This strike action this morning could have been avoided. The government has ensured that there is a strike this morning, and our employers, unfortunately, have not found the political courage or will to make this agreement so that we could talk next week.
At a London hotel, union officials worked and waited through the night as a deal took shape. At 4:15 this morning, the employers faxed a draft agreement to the union. By 5:45, the union had agreed to suspend the strike. But at 6:20, the employers said they'd contacted John Prescott's office about the draft agreement and been told he couldn't see it before 9. Minutes later, Andy Gilchrist said the Deputy Prime Minister would have to examine the document by 7:30 to give him time to call off the strike. At 7:25, the government confirmed it couldn't move before 9. And 5 minutes later, the union said the strike was on.
Where's that John Prescott? Get him out here.
Firefighters gathered outside the Deputy Prime Minister's office at lunchtime, making their feelings clear.
Two Jack! Get out of here!
But the government was equally angry about the employer's offer, which ministers described as a surrender.
Concessions were made, one after another, to the FBU, nothing in exchange from the employers. And the outcome was a document that quite simply could not deliver the modernisation necessary to justify a substantial pay increase for firefighters.
The firefighters believe they've been forced into a strike by government interference. But ministers believe they're in a battle with a militant union which expects higher pay without radical change. Rory Kettlin-Jones, BBC News.
The last week has seen frantic negotiations between the two sides, with each side offering their own version of what was or what wasn't on offer. Fergus has been looking into it all. Fergus, can you make it any clearer for us?
Well, Fiona, this is the deal the employers and the unions thought they could start negotiating on. It's just 2 pages long, so what's in it? Well, on pay, it would have meant a 16% increase over 2 years. 4% now, another 3.5% to be paid next April, a further 7% would follow in November 2003. Now, you may realise that doesn't quite add up to 16%. That's because there are other costs. A new pay structure for part-time or retained firefighters, and a promise that all qualified firefighters will have basic pay of £25,000 a year. Now, this deal says the pay increases are linked to modernisation. Key to this would be more flexible working and an end to the ban on overtime. There'd be improved medical training. Many would become paramedics. There'd be fewer firefighters on duty at night and more flexible, family-friendly shift patterns to encourage more women to join. Now, both sides have agreed that an independent panel would have the final say on what changes are made. But the key question, who foots the bill? Well, the 16% pay deal is reckoned to cost around £200 million. Now, the employers say they can't pay all of that and admit it means significant additional costs over and above any efficiency savings from modernisation. And here's the key point. We will explore with government how this situation can be resolved. In other words, the employers wanted ministers to help bridge the gap. Now, we pay for the fire service out of council tax bills. Employers have already budgeted for part of this rise next year. Even so, we've calculated it would mean just over a 1% extra increase on council tax bills, or 12 pence per household per week. The government says it wasn't going to sign a blank cheque to underwrite this deal, which would eventually have had to be picked up by the taxpayer. And so the deal's off and the strike goes on. Fiona.
Thanks, Fergus. The firefighters are laying the blame for the collapse, as you've heard there, squarely with the government and with the Deputy Prime Minister. A short time ago, they still feel the public are behind them. In a moment, Richard Bilton will be gauging the extent of that support. But first, our correspondent Catherine Marston spent the day with the firefighters at Gipton Fire Station in Leeds. Catherine, you were at that same fire station this time last week. How does the mood compare?
There is a dramatic change in the mood of the 52 firefighters here at Gipton. Even on the picket lines last week, they were optimistic and hopeful. Tonight, they're not. They're just plain angry. They say that a 16% pay increase that they would have been happy to accept feels like it was just snatched away at the last minute. And so tonight, they're back on the picket lines where they don't want to be. But they seem more determined than ever to dig their heels in. A sombre walkout for Whitewatch. They should be starting 4 days of work. Instead, they're starting 8 days of strike.
But the Fire Brigade Union shouldn't be out on strike.
They're furious, fed up and frustrated here. None of them can believe they're back out on strike. Dave Skews was on the picket line in 1977. Chris Rose has been a firefighter for 18 years. They'll both lose half their wages this month, but they're sticking to their guns.
And it's tearing our hats out to be here, but what else can we do?
So going out on strike to fight for this pay rise is more important than people's lives, is it?
The lives of our family, friends are all at stake as well. When we're not here, when we're at home on a night, we're in houses that have fires.
Would you be prepared to go out on strike again after your 8 days?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
If needs be, absolutely.
For as long as it takes?
Yeah.
So they're preparing for the long haul, chopping enough wood to keep the fire going in the week ahead. But with little sign of a resolution, it may not be as easy to keep their spirits high. But for now, it seems that there is no sign of the determination waning here. But of course, the firefighters are also acutely aware of how desperately they need to keep the public support. Can they do that? Well, Richard Bilton has spent the day on the housing estate that surrounds this fire station.
Catherine, yeah, this really is a busy, built-up area of Leeds city centre. Tens of thousands of people live in this area. On this estate, they've already had a green goddess here today. I spent the day here asking people what they think of the strike and what they think of the people who are going on strike.
Dumped and set alight, a green goddess came and put this out this morning. But the incident left people who live here nervous. People like the Evans sisters, who support the strike in principle, but worry about another week with the fire station closed down.
They do set cars afire at the back of our houses on the field, but fire engines can't get onto the field anyway, so those army ones have just got no chance at all.
Now, what do people say when they're talking about how much they're after?
I agree with what they're doing, but it's a lot to be asking for at the end of the day, isn't it? Maybe a bit less.
And there's an increased awareness in the nearby flats.
The green goddess came to put the fire out. There were
Brian Broughton saw the flames from his top floor flat. He and wife Ada want a fair deal for the firefighters, but they want the strike to stop.
We do feel vulnerable because we've been up on top floor. If anything happens, it's a long way up.
I mean, people are worried, and they hope it doesn't last long. That's the only thing.
431, please.
Babu Limchia runs the local shop. He's seen the headlines worsen. He says everyone who lives and works here is thinking about the strike.
If the fire broke out, then my family, I got 2 children with me, and it does worry me.
There is still plenty of support here, but little stomach for a week of action.
Some people think it is going to be a very long week. Now, there is that support here, but I think it comes with pressure. People want the firefighters to get a decent deal, but they want them to get it quick and then go back to work. Fiona.
Richard, thanks very much. A British man
provide cover for striking firefighters. The firefighters themselves walked out of the country's stations at 9 o'clock this morning. They claim the government sabotaged an imminent resolution to their pay demands. So far, there have been no serious emergencies around the country. Alan Mackay reports on the day's events.
The strike is only minutes underway and a green goddess speeds past a Glasgow fire station on its first call. Firefighters make it clear their quarrel is not with the military. But 8 potentially gruelling days now lie ahead in which their resolve and the armed forces' renewed capability will both be tested. Each Scottish fire region is now to have one of the so-called red goddesses added to its strength. Ministers say it will reduce the risk to the public, but with overnight optimism gone and the pay fight well and truly resumed, is the public support for the firefighters set to fall as well.
What I've heard so recently is that the government couldn't make a decision until after 9 o'clock. I mean, they don't start work till 9 o'clock or something like that, or their secretaries don't come in till 9 o'clock. I mean, to me that was just absolute nonsense.
The firefighters are asking a bit too much, because everybody else that feel that they are in responsible jobs concerning the public, they'll also want the same.
As the firefighters leave, a fresh row breaks out in Strathclyde as specially hired security staff take up their positions inside stations across the region.
The firemen that's on strike have got to get permission to allow them on the premises.
Strikers say the guards are under instructions to intervene if firefighters want to help the military on humanitarian grounds.
If there's a RTA in front of this station today, then the personnel here will not get access to the station to get even just basic equipment off of the appliances to go and assist, and they'll be left with just their own 2 hands to try and deal with what could be a very serious situation.
The security arrangements we've put in place would slow them down by no more than 10 or 15 seconds. In other words, the keys to the vehicles and the vehicles themselves are readily available to our staff.
Another walkout at Falkirk, and Labour MSP Cathy Peaty breaks party ranks to back the firefighters. Colourful language from this Labour backbencher defies the government's firm stand on the strike.
We shouldn't be here. John Prescott should have got out together this morning. I'm ashamed of him.
But welcoming the Irish Taoiseach to Scotland, the First Minister says the parties to the dispute must talk as well.
An 8-day strike is a dangerous move in this dispute, and I hope that the strike can still be postponed and negotiations can start again.
And even those trying to relax just couldn't escape day one of the strike. Thankfully, the only short-term effects of a small fire at the Dalkeith Leisure Centre were the victims' blushes, as they wondered if their clothes would be safe.
Well, Alan Mackay is at the Military Command Centre in Stirling now, where the emergency response is being coordinated. 9 or 10 hours or so in. Alan, how's the country faring so far?
Well, Sally, just before you came over to us, we learned from the military commanders here that, in fact, a serious fire had broken out in the west end of Glasgow. It's apparently in a top-floor flat on the Crow Road, and thankfully for the military, it's very close to the Maryhill Barracks, where the Green Goddess and the Red Goddess were sent out from. And we also understand that, thankfully, no one appears to have been in the flat at the time of the fire. I think the story today is that there have been far fewer calls than perhaps in the first hours of the 2-day strike, and also a pleasing trend to the military here. There have been far fewer hoax calls. I think the bigger story of the day may be the political slanging match that has developed since the overnight talks. The government criticising the firefighters, the union having a go at government ministers, and then perhaps in the middle we have the local authority employers who are quoted as saying they're very disappointed that a deal hadn't been signed up to by the government.
Alan, how is the military's coordination effort actually being handled from where you are now?
Well, the military say they're delighted at the way things are progressing. They say they've learned lessons, particularly on the control and command side from the last strike, and they say they're ready for any big emergency should it happen. We can look at the map over here. You can see the coloured arrows. These are the 50 or so temporary service fire stations around the country. You can see, obviously, they're centred around the cities in the Central Belt and Tayside and Inverness. And although there appear to be large areas in the Highlands where there's no cover, in the Central Highlands and also down in Dumfries and Galloway, people there shouldn't be concerned. We have to go to the map behind me, because here, this is where the retained firefighters are based, and so the military are telling us that they're quite happy that the whole of Scotland is well covered and prepared for any big fire emergencies.
Alan Mackay, thanks very much.
So, the country faces up to 8 days without its professional fire service. But much of the country, as we're hearing from Alan there, is covered by retained fire crews who aren't taking strike action. Where does it leave us? Our Home Affairs correspondent, Revel Alderson, is at Maryhill Fire Station in Glasgow. Revel.
Well, David, how it leaves us here is in a city like Glasgow,
no cover at all. In the rural areas we do have some cover. In the cities, a huge amount of support. You can hear the horns being beeped in the background as cars go by along Maryhill Road. But the mood here is of disappointment, I think, amongst the firefighters. And I was here at 9 o'clock this morning when the strike began.
It's the stroke of 9 a.m. and Blue Watch at Maryhill Fire Station in Glasgow joins the strike. Despite the support from passing motorists, they're angry, bitter and frustrated they're out and concerned at the consequences of this prolonged strike.
Bearing in mind it's over the weekend, it is over 8 days, the consequences for this country will be dire.
Hopefully that won't be the case, but as I say, it's an action that we feel we have to take. We've been forced into this corner. We don't want to be here, but unfortunately that's just the way it is.
The Joint Operations Centre in Inverness.
Fire control, Dave Sullivan speaking.
Here, fire crews in the north are coordinated. Despite the strike, emergency calls should still be made in the normal way, dialling 999. In some areas, the response will be as usual, with part-time retained crews working normally. In the Highlands and Islands, 1,000 retained firefighters will work alongside RAF crews in Green Goddesses. In Grampian, 33 retained stations are working normally. And in Tayside, crews at half of the retained stations will turn out if called. In central Scotland, only 2 retained stations will work normally, leaving firefighting in the region to Navy crews. While in Fife, retained men at 3 stations will work, including some FBU members. Lothian and Borders has 13 rural retained stations ready to respond. 60% of Strathclyde's retained crews and all volunteer units in the islands will work, but the urban stations are solidly out. Finally, in the southwest, only the full-time crews in Dumfries town are taking strike action.
We told you the importance of making a fire action plan. Did you make one?
The strike doesn't mean there'll be more fires than usual, but this advert being screened by the executive aims to help prevent them. Senior officials say planning ahead can avoid a fire starting.
Most fires, most deaths occur in the home, and that's where people can be most careful. Simple precautions, making sure that they deal with electrical apparatus, candles, cooking safely.
Revel, it's one thing having to deal with a one-day strike, as we saw last week. An 8-day strike is a different proposition entirely.
Absolutely, and the guys behind me here on the picket line at the Maryhill fire station know that. That's why they wanted something to be done to avoid the fact that Scotland is effectively without the best form of fire cover for the next 8 days. And what's worse, David, is towards the end of next week, another strike will take place for 2 days of the fire crews at Scotland's 3 main airports, Glasgow, Edinburgh and Aberdeen. And Aberdeen in particular will be very badly hit because almost half of the flights from it are to the North Sea oil fields, and that could really affect commercial operations in the North Sea.
Revel, thank you. Still to come on tonight's programme, mopping up dozens of homes.
This fire would have been tough to fight. It took hold in a disused plastics factory on a tightly packed industrial estate where the flames threatened to engulf neighbouring buildings. For the first time here, the army teams were able to call out 6 red fire engines commandeered from a fleet of training vehicles. The heat was intense and 5 soldiers were treated for smoke inhalation.
I do believe that there were some people working in the building, but exact numbers not known, and they were evacuated very early on.
Striking firemen who saw the smoke from their picket line 3 miles away went to help, but when it became clear that there were no lives at risk, they returned to their station.
We are the watch that will be on duty, and we're not very happy about this. We don't want to be here, and we think we've been pushed by the government and forced to do this.
Especially after this morning's fiasco.
It makes me feel bad. Me and John should be on today, but we are here today on shift, and we'd have been turning out to that job.
It took 5 hours to bring the blaze under control. For a makeshift fire service, this was a long and difficult day. This fire was subdued by 100 or so soldiers using a ragtag collection of outdated or decommissioned equipment. The wet weather may have been kind to them, but there's no doubt they did an exceptional job. A blaze of this ferocity would normally have been tackled by dozens of conventional fire engines. Geraint Vincent, ITV News, West Bromwich.
Well, firefighters have broken their picket lines to help, but by and large, the armed forces must cope on their own. So exactly how many fire engines are in service tonight? Well, usually there's more than 3,000 modern red engines protecting Britain. They've now been replaced by 827 Green Goddesses, plus 27 red engines normally used for training firefighters. Paul Davis reports on what's been happening around the country.
Tonight, it is the military and their Green Goddesses to the rescue. On the M4 motorway in South Wales, RAF teams deal with the aftermath of a collision that left several people in hospital. It is grim work the armed services will have to get used to. For at 9 o'clock this morning, firemen and women across the country walked out on strike. A deal that would have prevented this stoppage had collapsed at the 11th hour. Blaming government interference, the firefighters began an 8-day stoppage, leaving the military to take on the mantle of public protectors. At Kings Lynn in Norfolk, RAF crews, helped by retained firefighters, put out a fire that had spread along a row of terraced houses. The RAF team soon discovering the hazards of fighting house fires.
The flames were coming over the top of us, so we got as close and we controlled the fire as much as we could. And then by the time we actually entered the bedroom itself, the floor collapsed underneath us, so we had to pull back.
In Yorkshire, a Green Goddess was called to an accident on the M1 near Wakefield. The driver was cut from the wreckage of his overturned car, but later died from his injuries. In Surrey, firefighters from union leader Andy Gilchrist's own station at Chertsey spent the day not on strike, but dealing with a major chemical alert at a nearby hospital. 20,000 litres of hydrochloric acid was leaking from a ruptured tank. Only when the hospital was safe would the firefighters join their striking colleagues.
What happens now? Are you going back to the picket line?
We will be making a gear up, and if we're still on strike, because I don't know what the situation has been through the day, then the lads will be going on the picket line, yes.
Tonight, firefighters in Kent also left the picket lines to attend a traffic accident where they believed lives were in danger. Paul Davis, ITV News.
Well, tonight, a settlement looks a distant prospect, with ministers, union leaders and firefighters' employers all blaming each other. The Deputy Prime Minister, John Prescott, had to deny
immediate and unconditional 4% pay increase this November. After that, firefighters would have received a further package worth 12% by next November, bringing their basic salary up to £25,000. Crucially, that money was tied to modernisation, but John Prescott said it wasn't tied tightly enough.
What happened last night?
Over. Police were at the scene a minute after the alarm was raised. They filled a bath and some buckets and put the fire out themselves. The householder claims the military took 15 minutes to turn up.
No faith in them whatsoever. You know, if my kids had been in the house, you know, I dread to think what would have happened to them. You know, no, bring back our guys. You know, give them what they want and just bring bloody back. This is ridiculous.
Normally, Polmadie Fire Station would have been called out. Instead, its firefighters were manning the picket line and furious over events in London.
Before, the government was just saying that it's employers that we have the problem with. It's now obviously that it's the government that we have the problem with.
It appears to me, and maybe appear to everyone else, that the government really want to break us and demoralise us.
The walkout came after a night of high drama. The union and fire employers had hammered out a draft agreement involving a 16% rise and a commitment to more talks on modernisation. But at 7:25 this morning, the government said it couldn't provide the extra money required for the deal. The strike was on.
We believe we had achieved something. We believe that the Fire Brigade Union thought we'd achieved something, and for it to be taken away right at the end because of the financial situation, I found very, very disappointing. I'd have to say I was angry, very angry.
Downing Street said the union was trying to hold the government to ransom.
The idea that the Deputy Prime Minister, on the basis of a phone call in the middle of the night about discussions that are unspecific, uncommitted, uncosted and unfunded, should then commit several £100 million of taxpayers' money is neither sensible or responsible.
The military has taken delivery of 8 Red Goddesses for this strike. 18 more are on the way. In the meantime, 5 of their older cousins were called to a fire at Dalkeith Leisure Centre. The building was evacuated. These men had been in the sauna and took shelter in a police car as the military operation got underway.
It's like organised chaos when they all arrived, you know, they're all running in different directions.
Unless there's a sudden breakthrough, the military will have another 8 days to get used to their new role. The firefighters here and across Scotland are now convinced they're in a fight with the government and no one else. And with both sides appearing equally determined, this is all the hallmarks of a long, bitter and dangerous dispute.
I've got to tell you, as a practicing firefighter, 27 years experience, that no matter what you do behind the desk, actually in the conference room, doesn't translate the same way out on the streets.
But often restrictive approaches by the FBU result in decisions not being taken to find new stations
I've got
and
to say
equip
that
them because people insist that things should remain the way they were in the past.
I'm sorry, Mr Rainsford, I've got to disagree with you there. I mean, I'm insulted by that assertion that we're restrictive in our practices. Firefighters go out of their way to move forward. We've been modernising since the beginning of this century, and if you look back through the history books, you'll see evidence, countless pieces of evidence for that.
Why is that control room in Wiltshire not being used? Because the FBU won't use it.
There were smiles as they parted, but Ian Fensham wasn't optimistic.
Do you think we're anywhere near a resolution to this dispute?
I don't, I've got to be honest. I've heard Mr Rainsford talk about the various issues up there again, but I've got to say I think they're sticking firmly to their policy that they're going to cut the service.
His view, but tonight...
Bloody firemen! If they won't do it, I'll do it my chuff himself. I mean, how hard can it be? Geronimo! Oh! What? Oh! Now don't panic, big fella. There must be a way out of this. Oh. Here. Oh. This is a chuffing disaster. I've missed me dinner.
To decide what badly damaged part of Edinburgh's Old Town is still burning, although it's now apparently been brought under control. It's thought some fires may burn inside buildings for hours to come. It began last night and has caused millions of pounds worth of damage.
Throughout the night, the sky above Edinburgh was lit up by a fire which took hold in the heart of the Old Town. The blaze broke out just off Cowgate, once a run-down area, now a magnet for weekend drinkers and clubbers. The fire started above a nightclub, part of a row of 7- and 8-storey buildings. The flames spread, and bars, offices and businesses have all been damaged. This is a designated World Heritage Centre, but it's thought none of the medieval buildings has been affected. 150 people had to be moved from their homes. The narrow streets and network of commercial and residential premises made the firefighters' job more difficult. As Edinburgh assesses the damage, it's clear the cost of the blaze will run to millions of pounds.
This fire's been so awkward to tackle, firefighters are still working to try to stop the flames from spreading further. And questions are already being asked about fire safety and how such an historic district of Edinburgh could have been so easily put at risk. Colin Blaine, BBC News, Edinburgh.
Let's cross lines. Well, night has turned to day, now it's night again. Firefighters have been there an awfully long time, haven't they?
They certainly have. It's been a very serious fire, one of the most serious in the centre of Edinburgh for many years. And as you say, firefighters have been working at it for nearly 24 hours now. Now, looking back to last night, there were, at the height of the fire, something like 100 firemen from 4 brigades. And it was burning away in the Cowgate, which is the old part of Edinburgh. Very fortunately, none of the listed buildings, which people were afraid for, have suffered as a result of the fire. There was fear in particular for one quite close to the centre of the fire, but firemen have been in there, they've managed to secure it, and they say it'll be all right. But it is a fire which will cost millions and has already caused a huge amount of damage.
And of course many shops and businesses affected there. What sort of questions are people asking about this?
Well, people are very concerned about this because obviously in a site like this, which is a World Heritage site, which has many listed buildings, which has premises packed quite closely together, the consequences of this fire could have been much worse. There was a concern that the nightclub could have gone up while people were still in it. Now you can see what's happening behind me at the moment. They're still working to try to get the fire doused down. Even after all these efforts, they're still concerned about the building, the end of the building, which stretches back from where we can see it. The worry is that it might come down of its own accord. Because it's been weakened, the floors have been burned away from the top story right down through 7 floors to the basement and the cellars below. And the anxiety is that because it's got no floors to help hold the walls up, the whole lot could come tumbling down. It really is a worry. The assessors have been trying to get in to decide whether the building's safe, but the fire brigade have made the decision that they won't be allowing members of the public back yet. Anyone who moved out of their flat or their house is going to have to stay away. Students, and there were dozens of those who live in that area, have been put up in temporary accommodation not very far from here.
So pretty dangerous conditions for the firefighters who are still having to work there, Colin. Any idea how much longer they're going to be there?
Well, I think it's going to take another day or so, at least, before the area can be declared safe. We know that one firefighter was injured. He's been off to hospital and is now back home again. He's all right. But they are taking no risks at all with this. Members of the public are not being allowed to get close to that building now. They've been told that there is a possibility it could come down. And in the long term, even if it doesn't come down, it may have to be demolished because it would be unsafe.
All right, we'll leave it there. Colin, thanks very much indeed.
Are still battling to contain a blaze which has destroyed a number of buildings in the city's historic Old Town. The fire has already caused millions of pounds of damage.
Edinburgh's Old Town ablaze. One firefighter said it looked like London during the Blitz. This is a World Heritage Site renowned for its historical architecture. Now the heart of the Cowgate area has been destroyed by fire. It's believed to have started in a shaft between a pub and a nightclub, and because the buildings are so old and 8 stories high, the fire quickly spread.
There's some quite expensive developments in there. There's some resources from the Edinburgh University in there that will be difficult for them to replace. And obviously, it's very sad when you see that kind of damage to the commercial centre of the town.
More than 150 people had to be evacuated from this area, not just people who were in the clubs and the pubs. People have lost their businesses, but people lived in this part of the city, so some people have actually lost their homes.
As the smoke hangs over the entire city, local people here are shocked and deeply saddened.
Quite sad, actually. It's sad to see all these old buildings going up in smoke, and it's a part of Edinburgh's history.
Firefighters have managed to stop the blaze from spreading, but these historical buildings are expected to continue burning for some time. Jane Chilton, Sky News, Edinburgh.
Thousands of Australian firefighters are...
This historic Old Town has been destroyed by a huge fire which has been raging since last night. More than 80 firefighters are still battling to bring the blaze under control. The fire started in a nightclub and homes, pubs and restaurants in the area have had to be evacuated. Here's Dan Rivers.
Almost 17 hours after it began and still the medieval heart of Edinburgh is smouldering. This is the worst fire in living memory here. This lunchtime, much of the area is still sealed off as some 80 firemen continue to damp down. About 150 people have been evacuated and at least 10 separate commercial buildings have been damaged. But incredibly, no one has been injured. The blaze started at about 8:15 last night above a nightclub on Cowgate in the Old Town, but it soon spread through the warren of shops and restaurants. Firefighters say had their strike been on, the army would have been struggling to cope.
It's taken the professionals this amount of time to bring the fire under control. Bearing in mind, you can see the appliances behind me. We have our specialist height appliances there that we have used extensively throughout the night to tackle this fire. Now, these appliances would not be available to the non-professional firefighter.
Some buildings in this World Heritage Site may now have to be demolished. The damage could run into millions of pounds. Dan Rivers, ITV News.
More hot and dry weather.
Good evening. More than 100 firefighters have been dealing with a major fire in Edinburgh's historic Old Town. The blaze started yesterday evening, but it's thought some fires could continue to burn for hours to come. There's been extensive damage to buildings. Pubs, clubs and homes were evacuated and roads in the area are closed. Our reporter Raymond Buchanan has been at the scene all day. Raymond, where exactly did the fire start?
Well, here right in the centre of the Old Town, about 500 yards in front of me is the Royal Mile, and then stretching down here at the South Bridge go to the university buildings, and then of course on the right hand side to the Cowgate area of the city where of course the fire started.
It started in the late evening and quickly spread, the flames lighting the skyline of the historic Old Town. The fire was so big that it consumed an entire block of buildings, reaching up 10 stories. It's thought the blaze began above a nightclub. Had it started later on in the evening, it would have been much more dangerous in this popular night spot. It took over 100 firefighters to bring it under control.
Well, there's been major structural damage done to the building. It was a very difficult fire to fight because the fire was on 4 fronts, and it's a very large and tall building. It stretches from the Cowgate right up to the South Bridge.
Amongst the fire's victims, the famous Gilded Balloon Theatre. It's thought some of the worst affected buildings could be demolished. Luckily, none of the listed properties were badly damaged, but it could take a long time for this part of the Old Town to recover.
There's been a great deal of damage done, and there will be a fair bit of demolition involved. But at this moment, the fire master is still in charge of the site, not happy that everything's out. So it might be another day before we can get our own engineers in to see what's going to come down.
The clear-up bill will run into millions of pounds, and there's still no clear indication as to what caused the fire.
Raymond, it's clear there's going to be a huge deal of disruption in the area tomorrow.
Yes, there will be tomorrow, and also tonight those dozens of people who had to be moved away from this area will have to spend yet another night in emergency accommodation. And if you can see behind me, they're hosing down some of the buildings. They're very weak and they don't actually know if they're structurally sound, and until they know that, this entire area will be closed off, causing...
It's now apparently been brought under control, although some fires may burn inside buildings for hours to come. It began last night and has caused millions of pounds worth of damage.
Throughout the night, the sky above Edinburgh was lit up by a fire which took hold in the heart of the Old Town. The blaze broke out just off Cowgate, once a run-down area, now a magnet for weekend drinkers and clubbers. The fire started above a nightclub, part of a row of 7- and 8-storey buildings. The flames spread, and bars, offices and businesses have all been damaged. This is a designated World Heritage Centre, but it's thought none of the medieval buildings has been affected. 150 people had to be moved from their homes. The narrow streets and network of commercial and residential premises made the firefighters' job more difficult. As Edinburgh assesses the damage, it's clear the cost of the blaze will run to millions of pounds.
This fire's been so awkward to tackle, firefighters are still working to try to stop the flames from spreading further. And questions are already being asked about fire safety and how such an historic district of Edinburgh could have been so easily put at risk. Colin Blaine, BBC News, Edinburgh.
And Colin told me the blaze was extremely difficult to control.
Well, this really was an extremely serious fire. It's one of those things that doesn't happen very often in Edinburgh, and I'm sure that people here will be hoping that nothing like it happens again. You get some sort of impression of how bad it was from last night's pictures. It took hold in a warren of a building, a place where there are lots and lots of little premises. Among those offices which was destroyed was the premises of the venue of the Edinburgh Festival, one of the venues there, the Gilded Balloon. The fire started, in fact, in a nightclub. The flames licked out of that part of the building into the sky. It's a 7-storey building, so it was burning away at the floors at the same time, so the building itself became unstable. It really was a fire which took hold very quickly. It could have been a lot worse if it had started later, when the nightclub and some of the pubs would have been much more full. But fortunately it started when it did. If it had been later, that would have been a bigger problem. But you get some impression, some idea of how difficult this was to deal with by the fact that the firefighters are still here. They worked here all during the night, all during the day, and back into the night now again. And you can see what they're trying to do. They're trying to dampen down inside the end of the building. We only get a view of part of it. It stretches back for something like 100 feet beyond our view. And the fear is that the whole building there is becoming very unstable. So the firefighters are having to use that hydraulic lifting equipment so that they themselves will be in a safer position for playing on the hoses.
Well, exhausting work for the firemen who we were just watching hosing down some of the premises there. Presumably, they're going to be there for quite a while longer then, Colin, from what you've been telling us.
Absolutely. We expect them to be here all night and into the following day. Different shifts, I'm sure, but certainly a presence here into the following day. Possibly it'll be another day before it's considered safe enough even to let council engineers in to look at the buildings to see what the damage is like. Now, a further problem, of course, is that the street in which I'm standing is normally a major thoroughfare. Now, it's one thing on a Sunday to have a street like this closed, but come Monday, there's going to be major traffic disruption in Edinburgh, which is always a difficult city anyway because of its position. So I think anyone who's intending to be driving in Edinburgh tomorrow ought to be paying attention to the traffic.
Good evening. A massive fire that ripped through the heart of Edinburgh's Old Town is still burning tonight and may burn for days to come. Scores of people were evacuated from their homes as the blaze took hold in Edinburgh's Cowgate last night. The damage is likely to cost millions of pounds, and the police are advising people to avoid the centre of the capital at all costs. From the scene, Roddy Scott sends this report.
This is proving a very difficult and dangerous fire to tackle. In fact, almost 24 hours after it started, firefighters are still trying to stop it from spreading. The design of the buildings on this World Heritage Site is preventing fire crews from getting to the heart of the blaze. The fire broke out in a nightclub at around 8:30 last night and quickly engulfed surrounding properties. 100 firefighters worked through the night to tackle the flames, but many of the buildings, including the Gilded Balloon Theatre and research facilities belonging to Edinburgh University, have been completely destroyed. The damage will cost millions of pounds.
The Cowgate is one of the most popular Saturday night venues in Edinburgh. It is perhaps amazing, therefore, that just one person, a firefighter, suffered minor injuries. Of course, an 8-day fire strike was scheduled for this period. Had that gone ahead, the consequences could have been much, much worse.
The internals of the building is like a rabbit warren inside. The fire itself was affected on 4 fronts. It's a very large footprint building, and the fires were very deep-seated and spread very rapidly. So yes, it was a very serious blaze indeed.
Around 150 people had to be evacuated from their homes as the fire spread. They haven't yet been told when they'll be able to return, but some are facing a long wait.
The whole area down there's been completely, gutted really. The building at the end's probably going to collapse, so they're just going to wait and see what happens with that and see if there's any gas leaks or anything.
Firefighters are likely to be on the scene until at least tomorrow night, and the roads will be sealed off until the fire is out and the area declared safe. Even if the buildings don't collapse, they may well...
Old Town is still burning tonight, more than 24 hours after it started. Firefighters say it may be 2 days before the flames are fully extinguished, and it's now feared that some of the damaged buildings, part of a World Heritage Site, may collapse. From Edinburgh, Martin Geisler reports.
This evening, almost 24 hours after it broke out, this blaze in the heart of Edinburgh's Old Town is still well alight. 80 firefighters are at the scene. It could be days before their job is done. The fire began above a nightclub in the Cowgate district of the city. Thousands of revellers were cleared from nearby bars as it took hold. This is one of Edinburgh's most popular Saturday night drinking haunts. Only one person, a firefighter, was slightly injured. But today it was clear the damage to homes and businesses in the 13 properties affected will run into millions of pounds. This is the heart of the city's Old Town. It sits between Edinburgh Castle and Holyrood Palace. It's a maze of medieval streets, and it's that complex layout that made this fire so difficult to tackle. Even with their state-of-the-art equipment, fire crews had problems. An 8-day strike had been scheduled to run over this weekend. Had that gone ahead, experts say the consequences could have been horrific.
These appliances would not be available to the non-professional firefighters. So I'll let you draw your own conclusion. It would be a very, very, very difficult fire with possibly a lot more damage.
This area is classed as a World Heritage Site, so ancient are some of its buildings. Today, the tourists were watching history go up in smoke, although it could have been far, far worse. Martin Geisler, ITV News, Edinburgh.
Ravaged by the massive fire in Edinburgh's Old Town will have to be demolished. The cost of the damage will run into millions of pounds. However, architects and historians insist that care must be taken in the reconstruction of the area. Fire crews have been at the scene of Saturday's blaze all day. Alan Mackay has the details.
The Great Fire of Edinburgh, in a part of the historic Old Town, now full of nightclubs fashioned from old premises. Hundreds of people were out for their Saturday night as the blaze ripped through and up into a complex of buildings. The city's Lord Provost says he's relieved only one person, a firefighter, was slightly hurt. Crews were brought in from all over the region and beyond, daylight showing how difficult the fire was to tackle, tall buildings and narrow streets below. Already the focus is on how to save the historic facades to the buildings.
What we've done is, with the demolition contractor, we've made arrangements for these facades to be photographed. And in fact, during the demolition, we're going to take some of the materials that we feel of particular importance and store them. And it's our expectation that these will be reinstated into the new development.
But as insurance claims arising from Saturday's blaze are drawn up, they'll reach millions easily. The city's political leaders will be coming under great pressure to make sure too much history isn't lost.
This is a very serious blow in the historic core of the city, a World Heritage Site. Our officers have been in touch with Historic Scotland because virtually the entire site's Category A listed, and we've been taking advice from them, and we'll try and make sure that we retain whatever historical character we can.
One owner, whose club is a popular venue for stand-up comics from all over Europe, is being urged to make sure something at least rises from the ashes.
I haven't had time to assess what we're going to do and everything, you know, and so many people have been contacting me, you know, from around the world, and, you know, it's been wonderful, the support that's been coming in.
The demolition squads could move in as early as tomorrow. The bad news for shop owners and motorists is that the road closures may last weeks.
An Inverness woman claims her chances of ever having a baby have been ruined after
closer inspection reveals the full extent of the damage. Buildings constructed in medieval times, now reduced to rubble. 3 days after the fire began, it was still burning, in pockets deep inside the ruined remains.
There's pockets of fire now that are in the centre of the building and are very, very difficult to access.
Evacuated residents sought permission to return to nearby homes, while the local council assessed the damage. They decided that much of what's left will have to be demolished. This is the seat of the fire, the Cowgate area of Edinburgh that dates back to the 18th century. Its historic buildings latterly had a contemporary use. A university computer department was burnt down, so too an amusement arcade. Several pubs and clubs were destroyed. Drinkers had to leave in a hurry. The damage will cost this city millions of pounds. The architectural loss is incalculable.
When people come to Edinburgh, they always comment upon the wonderful contrast in the architecture between where we are and old Edinburgh, and they have a feel for what an old capital city during the medieval period would have been like.
And what destroyed the medieval part of the city remains a mystery for now. Fire investigators have had to wait to enter destroyed buildings, because after 3 days of fire, they are too unstable. James Matthews, Sky News, Edinburgh.
It's an exaggeration to say that it looks like a bomb site. From the layout below, it's also clear to see why this was such a difficult fire to tackle, and impossible to believe that any of this site will be left standing.
The demolition work will probably start tomorrow morning. Where possible, the facades will be saved.
Part of the demolition will be to photograph the facades of the building, and where parts of those facades are important, we will in fact take them away for storage, and that will be incorporated into the new development.
Indeed, the City Council is keen to return life to this formerly vibrant area as soon as possible. But aside from costing tens of millions of pounds, the damage is likely to take years to repair.
This is the worst fire we've had in living memory. It's destroyed a very large portion of the city's historic core, and we now have what I can only describe as a gaping wound in the heart of the city.
Almost 48 hours after it started, the fire is now out. It will take a great deal longer for the scars it has left to heal.
Well, the fire destroyed an important part of the capital's cultural life. Every year, thousands of people from all over the world watch shows at the Gilded Balloon. Every weekend, hundreds more flock to nightclubs, now razed to the ground. Our chief reporter, David Cowan, has been talking to some of those who've lost their livelihoods.
The Cowgate was always a world away from the shortbread tin image of Edinburgh, but for entertainment, this was often the place to be. The Gilded Balloon was a world-famous comedy venue where household names like Steve Coogan and Eddie Izzard nurtured their careers.
I started the Gilded Balloon in 1986 here, and it's the heart and soul of the Gilded Balloon. This is where it started, and it's 17 years, you know, over.
Somewhere beneath the rubble lies 2 nightclubs.
Hi, Stuart again.
Staff from Labelle and Gel were today frantically trying to rearrange live performances.
It was a very run-down, derelict part of the city, and was arguably the most vibrant part of the city until Saturday. And now all that's gone completely? It's gone, yeah. And I think it's all irreplaceable, unfortunately.
The buildings housed a host of small businesses, DJ booking agencies, graphic designers and artist studios.
Most of all, I'm thinking about the people who have lost their life's work. There are artist studios there, small businesses, everything's gone. And for them, I feel nothing but the greatest sympathy. I don't know how you begin again after that.
On the South Bridge, shops and flats were destroyed. 114 people were evacuated from their homes in the area, most are facing a 3rd night in temporary accommodation.
Saying maybe tonight and then maybe tomorrow, they don't know. It's just, they keep telling us every day it's maybe today and then it's not, so.
Report today, and it made grim reading for the firefighters. Sir George Baines said they were relatively well paid and modernisation had to be the priority. Among the proposed changes, backed in principle by the government, a pay rise of just 11% over 2 years, tied to reform. That includes more fire prevention work carried out by officers, shared control rooms with other emergency services, an end to the current overtime ban, and the loss of up to 3,500 jobs. Tim Rogers is at a fire station in Sheffield tonight. Tim.
Well, none of the firefighters here were expecting any good news, and the view is now that they didn't get any. We've been spending the day with these men, gauging their reaction.
When Sir George Baines spoke, there were few surprises in Sheffield. Listening to a message short on detail, but with a promise of sweeping changes to come, Red Watch were unimpressed.
Said nothing new at all. How he's managed to do it in 12 weeks when they've already had one review and brought out a white paper that took 2.5 years. But basically, the government don't want that paper.
They're just going to reduce the number of firefighters, and that's all it means. Less firefighters on fire engines. So, of course, it puts people at risk.
We've not learnt anything, basically, from what he said this morning. We already knew that from his earlier press release.
A key point in the report is the need to concentrate on fire prevention. But Red Watch took me on a factory inspection to show that this is already a major part of their job.
This is actually a fire escape route from the upstairs. Trip hazard straight away at the bottom.
In the control room, Shirley Haylock believes plans for combined centres are also flawed.
We already have emergency control rooms working effectively and efficiently. And if the Bain report will say that by amalgamating all the controls we will get that type of efficiency, then that's fine, but we won't.
In the end, the government says firefighters must change and adapt. Red Watch point out they spend much of their time already doing just that. But what no one wants here are fewer jobs.
So what of the 40% pay claim that these men were after originally when they went on strike? Well, clearly that now seems to be clearly out of the question. They're going to have to settle for much less. But what they point out is that these are clearly strings attached to the 11% that Bain is suggesting. Back to you.
Thank you, Tim.
Now, how much money will you have to live on?
Independent review into fire service pay are irrelevant. The review by Sir George Bain confirms his initial recommendation that pay should go up 11% in exchange for radical changes to working practices. That would include an end to the overtime ban and fewer night shifts.
They think they're worth a lot more. Firefighters say skills like those deployed here at a Nottingham school tonight are undervalued. Now an independent review has decided they're wrong. Their skills are roughly the same as those of a car mechanic, and only radical change can produce higher pay. That's the conclusion of Sir George Bain's review, which calls for a very different fire service.
We recommend changes in virtually every aspect of the fire service, as you will have seen from the report, to bring it up to the best standards of other organizations at the beginning of the 21st century in both the private and the public sector.
The Bain review is about far more than pay, but it does recommend a rise. 4% now, 7% next year, but only if firefighters sign up to modernisation. That would include flexible shifts and overtime, while the fire service would be allowed to charge firms for call-outs to false alarms. The report isn't explicit about job losses, but does assume that at least 3,000 would go over 3 years, though without compulsory redundancies. Their union had already dismissed this report as irrelevant, and firefighters who spent the day dealing with a blazing oil depot in Redditch said ideas such as reducing cover at night would put lives at risk.
We cannot operate effectively if we reduce crewing levels at night. Any safety critical fires, they happen at night.
But the government's message has been it's Bain or bust, and the Deputy Prime Minister said the union couldn't ignore the report.
Mr. Speaker, I have urged the FBU throughout this dispute to talk and not to walk. I recognise that the FBU has set its face against the Bain changes, but change is on its way, and the FBU can't set its face against that.
The union has threatened to take fire engines off the road again at the end of January if it doesn't get an acceptable pay deal. The firefighters don't like the vision of their future mapped out in the Bain report, but there may be nothing else on offer. Rory Catherine-Jones, BBC News.
Rory Catherine-Jones joins me now. Is there nothing else apart from that report you're holding in your hand on the table at the moment? Is that the only deal?
Well, Michael, the firefighters detest this review. They say it goes completely against research undertaken by the government previously, indicating more firefighters are needed, not fewer. But for the government, this is set in stone. It's really the route map to the future. And for the employers, well, they'll find it very difficult now to offer more than the 11% this recommends without finding that money themselves. The government's not going to provide it.
Where does that leave the Fire Brigades Union?
Well, the government seems very confident it's got the union on the run at the moment. It's saying Andy Gilchrist, the firefighters' leader, by raising this whole issue of pay in the first place, by wanting to go away from the old pay formula, he's set himself a trap and he's walked into it. He's brought forward questions of modernisation, which the fire service has wanted to address for many years, and now those firefighters are going to have to face really radical changes. The union, on the other hand, is still saying, well, we got that mandate a couple of months back. We got a 9-1 vote in favour of strike action. We're still prepared to use it. That mandate may be tested, though, over the coming weeks and months.
Rory, thanks.
Initial review of the country's fire service as irrelevant. The Bain report proposes an 11% pay rise allied to radical modernisation. But as Rory Scott now reports, the firefighters' response gives little cause for optimism as more industrial action looms.
Scotland's firefighters say they have little interest in anything this man has to say, but Sir George Bain believes wholesale change is critical.
Hesitation would be fatal. I have talked about the widespread recognition of the need for change. We now need to take this opportunity or lose the best chance we've had for many years to reform the service.
Bain agrees that firefighters deserve a pay rise, 4% this year and 7% next year, totalling 11%, provided there is significant modernisation. The recommendations include an end to the ban on overtime working. Where possible, joint emergency control rooms should be considered. Firms could be charged if firefighters are called out to false alarms, and significantly Bain suggests a change to the shift patterns, and that could see fewer firefighters working at night.
The fire that gutted a number of buildings in the Cowgate area of Edinburgh just over a week ago started at night. Bain also says there is no need for compulsory job losses, but even that has failed to win any points with the firefighters' union. They see the report as irrelevant.
Nothing that I can read into it is very positive at all. There's been a number of reviews of the fire service, and we'll take cognizance of them more than we will Bain. Bain's having a very short-term report, and I think it's not been very helpful.
Difficult then to see how the employers, the local authorities, are going to convince the firefighters that the package is a positive one, but they're going to have to try.
Here we've got an opportunity of a brand new independent report being put on the table where we can take a bit of time to look at that and see how we can drive that whole agenda of modernisation of the fire service forward. And I think that's worthwhile doing.
The Fire Brigades Union will meet with ACAS in London on Thursday, but face-to-face negotiations with the employers will not take place until January. 2 48-hour stoppages are planned for the end of next month if talks are still deadlocked.
The father...
Demolition of buildings destroyed by the fire in Edinburgh's Old Town. Businesses in the surrounding area were shut down as work began. It's hoped the area will reopen to traffic by the new year. A painting by the Italian artist Canaletto has been...
Of a plane that caught fire and crashed into a car near Aberdeen Airport say everyone involved had a very lucky escape. The 2 Danish men and the woman driver of the vehicle all escaped with just a few cuts and bruises.
No sooner had the plane got airborne than it came down again, crashing into a car driving along the busy main access road to the airport. One of its propellers came to rest right beside the vehicle. First to arrive at the scene was a taxi driver.
If you could just imagine a huge big fireball, it's reaching up 20, 30 feet into the air and quite intense heat. And this really thick black smoke which covered this whole area. You couldn't see anything at all.
Taking off in good visibility, the plane only made it 200 metres beyond the airport fence, ploughing into a field and then through a hedge onto the road. Fire swept through the main body of the aircraft, but it was empty. The car driver was treated for shock, the 2 pilots for cuts and bruises. The crew told medical staff they'd been very lucky.
Seemingly about 100 feet off the ground, but still over the airport complex. I think they lost the right-hand engine, and also I think they talked about a fire. And very quickly, obviously, the plane had a crash landing.
An investigation's already started into an accident from which it seems all involved had a miraculous escape. George Eakin, BBC News.
A man accused of 9 rapes crashed on takeoff from a North Carolina airport in the United States. The aircraft, a US Airways express jet, flipped onto its back before hitting the ground close to a hangar at Charlotte Douglas Airport.
When the plane hit the ground, it exploded into flames. The impact was so severe, the fuselage ploughed out a crater. The police say the remains of the plane were just debris. There wasn't much to see. All 21 people on board died. There were 19 passengers and 2 crew, but no one on the ground was hurt. The moments after the crash were captured on a small digital camera. Those near the airport could only watch.
I seen a plane going straight up in the air, and then all of a sudden it just did kind of like just flipped over and started nosediving straight into the ground, and then I didn't see it after it got behind the building, but then I saw a ball of fire come up from behind the building in the black smoke.
The plane was scheduled for a short commuter flight to a nearby airport at Greenville, Spartanburg. It had only just taken off when it seemed to lose height. It clipped the side of a maintenance hangar close to the runway and flipped over.
When we left the station, we thought we had a building on fire and a crash, and of course we had both of those. And we immediately put out the fire and started searching for any type of survivors.
It's too early to know what caused the accident. The weather was bright and sunny, but it was icily cold, and there were gusting winds which can affect small aircraft. A crash investigation is underway. It's thought the last radio...
Into the circumstances running up to the disappearance of...
Erica killed 21 people. Burning wreckage is all that's left of the small US Airways commuter plane. It flipped over after taking off from Charlotte Douglas International Airport in North Carolina and collided with an airport hangar. Officials say it's not terrorism, but a terrible accident. Harriet Harman
be at risk with the resumption of the strikes in the fire service earlier today. The latest walkout has sparked fears from military commanders that the public have become complacent about the risk of fire. Operation Fresco swung back into action at 9 this morning with 2,000 military personnel on standby right across the country. Well, Alan Mackay is at a fire station in Glasgow. Alan, are the military worried about coping with the risk of serious blazes?
Jackie, I think what the military are trying to flag up today is that although the government have reintroduced the advertising campaign, alerting the public to the dangers of fire, that people's minds have just been diverted onto other news events since the strikes were suspended before Christmas, and they may just not be being careful enough. The military insists their equipment and personnel are up to the task, and perhaps thankfully this morning has been a quiet one all over Scotland.
OK, that's 9 o'clock, all the regions are in, and we now have control in Scotland.
1 day shy of 10 weeks since the fire strikes began, and the military are back on fire watch.
Simultaneously, Scotland's 4,500 professional firefighters walk out once again, but into the political unknown. Their union's position that modernisation cannot simply mean cuts in jobs. With a way through the pay impasse not in sight, the military have no option but to step in once again. Their commander's major worry this time that the public may have lost that high awareness of the risk of fire which they had before Christmas and the suspension of the strikes.
Certainly within this region I've noticed a lessening of expectation of a fireman's strike. We have been training on the ground to allow the public to see us and also try and emphasise the safety issues.
Every party to the dispute is hoping that a blaze on the scale of what's become known as the Great Fire of Edinburgh will not take place during a strike. The blaze in the capital narrowly missed the last strike. Proof say firefighters that jobs mustn't be cut.
This dispute has moved backwards since this began, because it started off as a fair wage campaign, a pay dispute. The government have hijacked this dispute and turned it into a cut of the fire service in the UK.
Military commanders say their firefighting effort won't suffer from the huge mobilisation of troops for possible action against Iraq. The sailors here aren't concerned at being left behind.
We prefer whatever's thrown at us at the time, you know. I mean, we're not there to sort of second guess these things. We're there just to do as we're told, to a certain extent, and that sounds like a cop-out, but that's what we're there to do.
The military say their firefighting equipment is being added to as the dispute continues, but they won't complain if today's strike edges the two sides closer together again.
But Alan, overall, the message to the public is to remain vigilant.
Absolutely, to remain vigilant, and householders and business people are being encouraged, if they discover a fire, to dial 999 immediately, and their calls will be dealt with accordingly by one of those control rooms we saw there. On the other side of the coin, the police are taking the opportunity to warn hoax callers once again that their actions will be dealt with quickly. They'll be fast-tracked to the courts, held in custody, and the
walkout. They're holding strikes and a dispute.
The city centre. Hundreds of people have been evacuated from nearby buildings in Suckyhall Street. Lindsay Rayburn was at the scene.
The fire broke out at around 7:45 this evening in the derelict flats above the Bank of China in the Charing Cross area of the city. At least 5 green goddesses and some so-called red goddesses are now at the scene. It's not thought anyone has been injured in the blaze. Hundreds of people have been evacuated from residential and commercial properties surrounding the building as the army battles to contain the blaze with Green Goddess water jets, which are struggling to reach the flames on the roof. Billy Miller runs the cafe underneath the fire.
I wasn't expecting it to be anything like this. I'm absolutely gutted. Driving the car and I couldn't get through Charing Cross, and I realised, seeing the flames, couldn't believe it.
Firefighters remain on their picket lines, however, this evening, sticking firmly to their pledge only to break the strike if lives are at risk. An army spokesman says the fire is now under control, but work will go on through the night to dampen down the building, which has now been deemed unsafe.
Has all but ruled out fast-tracking a law through the Scottish Parliament to break the fire dispute. In an emergency Holyrood statement, the Justice Minister clearly set the executive against Westminster's plan to take direct control of the fire service. Here's our political correspondent, Glenn Campbell.
Striking firefighters in Glasgow strongly opposed to Deputy Prime Minister John Prescott's plan to impose a settlement.
It seems very dictatorship. He's trying to force us into something that, you know, isn't the best thing.
It's not just firefighters that are fuming. Privately, their employer, Scotland's councils, think John Prescott's made a tactical blunder which can only inflame this dispute. The SNP's demanding a separate Scottish solution, and many Liberal Democrat and Labour MSPs are really uncomfortable at what they see as bully boy tactics.
Whatever else you may call this, it ain't democratic, and it ain't something that Labour-led executives should even be contemplating.
In Parliament, no one spoke in favour, and the man in charge of Scotland's fire service all but rejected Westminster's plan.
I do not envisage that in the remaining weeks of this Parliament we would be in a position to come forward with firm legislative proposals for Scotland, whether in terms of a sole motion or a bill.
But critics accuse the executive of weakness.
The Deputy First Minister accuses the Fire Brigade Union in his statement of blaming everyone and taking no responsibility themselves. This government stands accused of exactly the same charge.
This is a classic helping of fudge. It will neither stand up to John Prescott or stand up to the Fire Brigades Union.
The Scottish Cabinet clearly hopes John Prescott backs off or firefighters negotiate a deal. Ministers don't seem to have a plan C. And tonight, a warning to Westminster from Sir David Steele. In a speech, he's effectively accused Mr Prescott of throwing a spanner in the works, threatening good relations between London and Edinburgh.
And military fire crews are tackling a blaze off Sauchiehall Street in Glasgow city centre. The fire in an empty part of a 4-storey building beside a University Hall of Residence at Garnet Street began shortly before 8 o'clock. 2 green goddesses, 1 red goddess and 2 teams with breathing apparatus were called to the scene. The fire is now under control and it's not thought anyone's been injured. A fierce time last night while providing cover during the latest firefighters' strike, which came to an end today. A man died in a house fire in Kilmarnock and there was a huge blaze in Glasgow city centre. Scotland's fire inspector said it was only a matter of luck that more people weren't seriously injured or killed. Jane Chilton reports.
The scale and ferocity of the fire in Sauchiehall Street stretched the military's capabilities. 5 stories ablaze, tackled by dedicated crews, labouring with ageing equipment. The military command requested help from Strathclyde striking firefighters, but because there were no lives at risk, they declined. All the military could do was stop the blaze from spreading.
The water damage is a nightmare. The place is ruined. Basically, the walls, the flooring, the ceilings, everything, all the paperwork, everything in there's pretty much ruined, so it doesn't look good.
Police sources say this is the second fire to hit this building in the last 8 weeks, both incidents happening when the firefighters were on strike. The first fire is being treated as suspicious, but as yet there have been no arrests, and an investigation has now been launched into this second devastating fire.
Luckily, no one was hurt in the Glasgow blaze, but the occupant of this house in Kilmarnock wasn't so fortunate. A 61-year-old man died when fire tore through his home early this morning. 1 other person managed to escape. And with a major explosion being averted when a gas tanker caught fire on the M74, Scotland's fire inspector says it's a miracle that more lives weren't lost.
We were certainly fortunate last night. The Sauchiehall Street fire could have been an awful lot worse, and the construction of the building helped prevent that. And the tanker incident where the cab caught fire but it didn't spread to the load was again incredibly lucky. Had it done so, the effect would have been devastating.
The next round of strikes are due to begin on Saturday. Already this dispute has cost the executive £10 million. But as the deadlock continues over pay, it's the threat of the
cramped cupboard, its equipment is outdated and much has been donated by the local community.
We are missing a lot of equipment essential to do the job we are asked to do. It's all done by the goodwill of the firefighters that come down here. We come down here twice a month to do the training, but the equipment is at a minimum.
This fire kit, the fire tunic, leggings, boots, helmet, fire hood and breathing apparatus are a complete ensemble.
This is how it should be for all firefighters in the Highlands and Islands. But because money is tight, it's only for the few, and in remote communities that has serious consequences.
Last night, for example, we had a house fire in Staffin-on-Skye. The unit there has not been upgraded, so the only thing that they could do is try and do some firefighting from the outside. They are not kitted to carry out aggressive firefighting. The nearest unit, which has been upgraded, was Portree, some 30 minutes away.
At Bewley, Highlands and Islands have upgraded their facilities. £1 million was promised from the Scottish Executive to help supply and train others. That's now been withdrawn, meaning 1 in 3 stations could close.
There are 43 volunteer stations without breathing apparatus that have the sword of Damocles hanging over them, because the Health and Safety Executive have said to us quite clearly that if we don't upgrade these stations to breathing apparatus and train with training, they will force a closure on us.
Back in Foyers, there's concern for the future of their fire service. Talks are continuing, but if areas like this don't get more funding to upgrade, they'll have a very long wait for help. Raymond Buchanan, reporting Scotland, Foyers.
And now here's Alison with all tonight's sport.
Fiona, thank you. And it's all change at Dundee United.
Anyone to find out, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see, but if it changes me later on.
And 20 years on, we asked him that same question again.
I came back certainly a different person, a person who was more mature, realised what...
3 people who serve the public, the fireman, the teacher and the nurse, each with concerns about what they're paid and how they work. Paul Ahmed has been a fireman for more than 20 years. He earns £21,000 a year. He says he'll strike because meeting the bills is hard. He works 4 days on, 4 days off, but rejects the idea he should get a second job to top up his earnings.
Because we work 42 hours, most people work only 37s, 39s, so I don't see how they can say I get more time off. I work 16-hour night shifts. When they're lying in the bed, I'm doing my work.
Jackie Glass has been a teacher for 13 years and she earns £28,000. For her, the issue is not pay so much as pressure. Workload and responsibility have been piled on, and despite the holidays, she says the job is now much harder.
It's ultimately not about the pay. There are more rewards than simply the pay, and that's an important issue. But that's why I stay with it, because the other rewards outweigh the problems and the difficulties.
After nursing for 14 years, Paul McVitie earns £26,000 a year. But that's at the top of his pay scale. He works shifts and has extra responsibilities for things like training. He says nurses have no appetite for a strike, but pay is a big issue.
I think pay is very important to a lot of people in the jobs that they do, and nurses are no exception. Obviously, they get a lot of job satisfaction from what they do, but I think it's becoming more and more important that the pay actually reflects the nature of the job they do and the fact that they're dealing with people's lives on a day-to-day basis.
Public employees have jobs right at the heart of our communities, and the firefighters say they want their pay brought into line. But the problem with this dispute is the difficulty in comparing jobs that have very different pressures, very different working conditions. Richard Bilton, BBC News, South Shields.
The ITV Evening News with Mark Austin and Katie Derry.
Good evening, welcome to the programme.
Hello. The Fire Brigades Union today set a date for their first national strike for a quarter of a century. They've called a 2-day stoppage beginning a week on Tuesday. The second will be on the weekend of Bonfire Night. There'll be others in the run-up to Christmas.
Fire crews voted by 9-1 for the strike action. It means that 999 calls will be answered by the Army's Green Goddess engines. Some of those are more than 50 years old. Paul Davis reports.
It was, as predicted by the unions, an overwhelming vote in favour of strike action. Across the country, almost 90% of firefighters voted to take on the government.
This is a truly phenomenal vote, which shows the enormous depth of feeling that is felt by people who work inside of the operational fire service. It is, quite frankly, a stunning answer to the government and the fire service and employers.
The unions say the first of a series of stoppages will start on October the 29th. Another strike is planned for the November weekend when the country holds its Guy Fawkes bonfire parties, traditionally the busiest time of the year.
I sincerely hope that the Fire Brigades Union will have second thoughts. There is a lot of public sympathy for firefighters, we know that, but their claim, their 40% claim, is completely out of line.
It's not just fire services which will be affected. Hospitals are already making extra plans for emergencies, particularly road accidents. Airports too are drawing up contingency plans for major accidents. In London, 19 of the deepest underground stations look set to close. The Channel Tunnel may be closed because it needs fire cover. And some football matches could be cancelled for the same reason. Michael Chubb, a veteran firefighter with the London service, is one of the many who voted to strike.
Don't want to strike, nobody wants to strike. It's an awful predicament to be in, but I feel the employers have left us no choice really with their silly offers they keep giving us.
After 23 years in the service, Michael Chubb says the one-bedroom flat he shares with his partner and 14-month-old son is all he can afford. When he set off for work this morning, he was anticipating a strike vote. He says all his colleagues on Blue Watch at Ilford Fire Station feel the same.
At this station, it was 100% vote yes, I believe. You know, the chaps at this station feel very strongly about it. You know,
And yeah, across the country 90%, and I think it's a message to the government that we do mean business.
Only once before have fire stations around the country closed their doors, shut down their appliances and turned their backs on the public. And that was 25 years ago. Then, as now, the Army and its ageing Green Goddess fire engines was called upon to provide protection that all sides agree is inadequate. Paul Davis, ITV News.
Well, as Paul Davis was saying, their Green Goddesses will be back on the streets the week after next. So how do they compare to the modern fire engines they'll replace? Helen Wright has been finding out.
Green Goddess crews in action during the Merseyside fire strike 7 years ago. In 11 days' time, fewer than 900 of these Army appliances will be covering for over 4,000 UK fire brigade engines. But are the men and machines up to it?
I don't think they can cope. I don't think they have the necessary training, the expertise, the skill set to be able to perform the function of the firefighter.
The differences between today's fire engines and the Green Goddess are striking. So how do their capabilities compare? Firstly, there's a considerable age difference. The average modern fire engine is around 7 years old. Green Goddesses are between 30 and 55 years old. Top speed for a fire engine is 70 miles an hour. The Goddess can only manage 35. Both carry the same number of crew, 6 fully trained firefighters on the modern engine, 6 armed forces personnel on the Goddess. But the fire engine's water capacity is much greater at 500 gallons. The Goddess carries just 300 gallons. But it's the equipment the two engines carry that really sets them apart. The Green Goddess has only the most basic firefighting equipment, a portable pump, 2 low-pressure hose reels and a first aid kit. The modern fire engine is equipped with the very latest devices to deal with the wide variety of emergencies fire crews face daily. It has hydraulic cutting gear, used in road accidents, for example. 4 sets of breathing apparatus for work inside burning buildings. Thermal imaging cameras used to find survivors in collapsed buildings. And as well as first aid and burns kits, there's life-saving resuscitation equipment. There's also a huge difference in cost between the two appliances. A new, fully equipped fire engine costs around £330,000. But despite their appeal to collectors, you can pick up a Green Goddess for less than £1,000. All sides in this dispute agree that the Green Goddess is not an effective substitute for the modern fire engine. So it seems inevitable that during the strike, millions of pounds of property will be unnecessarily lost to fire. Though everyone's biggest fear is that lives that could have been saved will be lost too. Helen Wright, ITV News, Central London.
The Old Bailey need genuine pay talks now.
The first 48-hour strike will begin on the morning of October the 29th, so there is still time, 10 days, to find another way.
Even at this late stage, I have to say I hope the firefighters will think again, think about their long-term interest and the lives of people that would be put at risk.
But the two sides are a long way apart. The unions want a 40% pay rise. The employers are insisting on a pay review.
The employers are perfectly willing to resume negotiations with the Fire Brigades Union once the independent inquiry, and it is independent, that is being chaired by Sir George Bain, has reported.
Over the next few weeks, perhaps months, we're likely to see fewer of these and more of these, the Army Green Goddesses, wheeled out to cover a strike for the first time in a generation. Soldiers have been training, they've got the basic firefighting skills, but they don't have anything like the experience.
At the moment, the military have got their own equipment. It's extremely basic. It is only a minimal public safety net. It's not intended to replace a professional firefighting force.
More of me, boys.
Firemen like Mark Toman from Northern Ireland say they don't want to strike, but have been left with little choice. To support his family, he works part-time as an electrician, a job he gave up 24 years ago to follow his chosen career, the one he now needs to supplement his pay.
I've had a young family, 3 young boys, and all the way through I've had to do from picking potatoes to washing cars, driving vans, anything to make up a decent living wage.
The only thing the two sides do agree on, a strike will put lives at risk. Glenn O'Glaser, Sky News.
A policeman caught on video punching and kicking a man is free on bail.
And the employers got to the end of the road in terms of negotiations on the 2nd of September, failed to reach agreement, and clearly there was a prospect of a strike. Now, in that situation, we set up the independent review, and we think this is the right way to resolve this.
But since they won't meet since they have no confidence in the independent review, and Mr. Gilchrist has told us why do you not say, all right, we've got to stop this strike at all costs? I mean, not at 40%, maybe, but at least let us talk to them. So John Prescott should sit down, and you should sit down and talk with them and say, let's try and find a way around this. Why can't you do that?
Because we have a group of 3 people, independent people, looking at all the evidence, assessing it, to come up with a reasoned judgment as to what is an appropriate level of pay for firefighters, and other measures as well, how the service can be modernised.
Let's deal with the reality. Well, should you not go to any lengths now? I mean, I know it sounds melodramatic and all that, but it's language that you yourself have used. People will die as a result of this dispute. Surely you should take any steps, any sensible steps, any possible steps to stop it happening.
We believe we have, and that the review is the way forward.
But they don't.
Now, what you're asking us to do, John, will be to double-guess the review by sitting down and having separate discussions.
Well, abandon the review. If they won't talk to you, if they will take no notice of the review, then abandon it and do something else.
I think that's a very, very foolish proposal, because if you have a serious review with eminent people, experienced people, already well into their work, they've taken evidence, the last day for evidence closed last Friday, they will be moving forward over the next few weeks to their recommendations, and surely it isn't too much to ask for the Fire Brigades Union to suspend any action until we get the result of that serious analysis of pay and conditions within the fire service.
You've said, as I say, that people will die as a result of this dispute. Do you believe that the undergrounds and the underground systems and the railways should close? Because we've already heard ASLEF saying that they will walk out if they're not satisfied, if their members are not satisfied that they're going to be entirely safe and the public will be safe. Is there an argument for saying the underground, or large sections of the underground and the railways, should simply not run during this dispute?
Well, this is a matter for the Health and Safety Executive,
who
we understand have issued guidance that it is not unsafe to operate the rail network, and that apart from a number of deep stations, which probably will have to be closed on the London Underground, perhaps 19, but otherwise the London Underground is perfectly safe to run.
And if there's an accident, if there's a crash?
Well, that is the judgment of the Health and Safety Executive, and clearly London Underground and the train operating companies have got to look very carefully at that and reach their judgment.
But your view, if they were to decide that they should close, they would have your support?
It's their judgment based on the advice they get, and we obviously would look very closely at any decision they reach, but we see no reason at the moment, from what we've heard, for this to happen.
One of the things that puzzles people a lot is all this talk about these ancient green goddesses, the things that only do about 40 miles an hour or whatever it is, and they're 50 years old. And yet, during the strike, if it happens, we will have lots of fancy new fire engines sitting in fire stations. Why cannot the Army, I know they're not trained in them, but it wouldn't take very long to give them basic rudimentary instruction, why can't the Army, the soldiers who are going to use the green goddesses, use modern equipment?
I think there are 3 reasons for that. Firstly, they are much more sophisticated. We make
have to train them, I acknowledge that.
And that takes time, and we haven't had very much time.
But you could start now.
We have now got trained military personnel ready to operate the green goddesses. We could not have done that if we were talking about the more sophisticated modern kit. Secondly, those appliances are mostly in fire stations, and they will almost certainly be picketed if the FBU go ahead with their strike action. It would unnecessarily draw the Army into an industrial dispute if they had to cross picket lines.
Isn't that better than people dying?
Well, I think it could inflame the situation. We have no wish to do that. We want to find an amicable and sensible way through this that does protect the public's interests to the best of our ability. And that's why we are arranging to deploy military personnel and green goddesses. We will also be running safety campaigns to advise the public of what measures need to be taken to minimise the risk of fire.
But I'm trying to imagine, and you must surely yourself have imagined this, somebody's house is on fire or whatever it may be, and there's a fire station 100 yards away with perfectly good fire engines sitting in it. and the soldiers can't get there in their ancient old green goddess, so their house burns down or somebody gets killed. I mean, you must have thought that. Surely, even if it upsets the Fire Brigades Union, even if you cross a picket line, it's worth doing.
Well, we are extremely worried about the situation because, as I've said on many occasions, and as Andy Gilchrist has also recognised, there is a risk that people's lives will be lost unnecessarily. That's why we say the Fire Brigade Union should now be calling off this unnecessary strike, should be waiting for the conclusions of the Bain Review, and then should sit down to discuss with the employers, the local authorities, the implementation of recommendations that come from the Bain Review.
Very quick thought. The police cannot go on strike for very obvious reasons. Should you change the law so that fire officers, firefighters cannot go on strike as well?
But we have no plans to do so. But it is, of course, interesting when comparisons are made between the levels of pay that apply in different services, that element isn't taken into account.
Are you prepared to consider introducing legislation that would make firefighter strikes illegal?
Not at the present time, because we hope that common sense will prevail and the firefighters will not go on strike.
Not at the present time, but you might at some stage in the future?
We have no plans to do so.
A final thought from you, Mr. Gilchrist. You are actually prepared to go ahead for a strike for 40% increase in pay that could put people's lives at risk. I mean, that's what it comes down to, isn't it?
We have always expressed the view this was entirely avoidable, and when the government reflects, it might regret where we are. We could have negotiated a position on pay with our employers, and then jointly with our employers could have come to the government and made the argument for funding. That's the right way to resolve this issue, would have been. However, the government involvement made that impossible.
Gentlemen, thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
Hour stoppage, but longer ones have been planned and the employers see no early way out. Tony Blair warned that no government on earth could yield to a demand for 40%, although his deputy John Prescott hinted at more than the 11% on offer. There have been hundreds of call-outs so far tonight, most of them minor, some of them false alarms. The military have attended dozens of locations across the United Kingdom. A 76-year-old woman died tonight after a house fire in Newtown, mid-Wales, which broke out an hour after the strike started. Our first report is from our industry correspondent, Rory Kethlen-Jones, who was with the strike leaders as the stoppage began.
6 o'clock this evening, and Lambeth firefighters take a step into the unknown. They know the first national strike for 25 years is a desperate gamble for their union. It was a scene repeated at fire stations across the UK, in Belfast, where over 96% voted for the strike, and in Burnley, another well-choreographed walkout. The man leading the union into this dangerous conflict with the government said it was sad but inevitable.
We do feel that we've been forced into this situation and been left absolutely no other option.
The union must have hoped it would never come to this, that the mere threat of a strike would be enough to produce a deal acceptable to its members. Even in the last 24 hours, Andy Gilchrist has met twice with John Prescott to talk about pay. As the Deputy Prime Minister left this afternoon's meeting, he said the talks had been about safety. Andy Gilchrist insisted they had also discussed pay, though the gap between his 40% demand and the employer's 2-year 11% offer appears as wide as ever. Then, just an hour before the strike began, one final appeal from the government.
Be reasonable, not unreasonable. Suspend the strike. Return to the negotiations which offer substantial pay for substantial reform. And I appeal to all firefighters, don't walk, talk.
That had also been the message from the TUC to the firefighters in the days after they voted to strike. But in Belfast tonight, the union movement's leader was rallying round.
The TUC supports them. We haven't committed ourselves particular figures, but we have for a decent deal, and at the moment that's not on offer, anything like the scale it needs to be.
The picket lines are in place, the fire engines will be locked inside until Friday night, and right now there's little reason to hope that the longer strikes planned in the coming weeks will be called off. Rory Kethlen-Jones, BBC News, Lambeth.
So what's the size of the task facing the military fire crews? On a normal day across the United Kingdom, there are 38,000 full-time and 18,000 retained or part-time firefighters. Tonight, protecting the public are 10,500 retained firefighters who are not on strike and 19,000 military personnel, some now already responding. Normally, Britain's firefighters are equipped with 3,000 fire engines and more than 800 support vehicles. Tonight, emergency firefighters are manning 827 Green Goddesses, a very basic fire engine, with backup from nearly 400 breathing apparatus and rescue support teams. Across the UK, on average, there are around 1,300 fires daily. And statistically, each day, just over 1.5 lives are lost in them. Our special correspondent Gavin Hewitt has been with firefighters and Green Goddess crews in the hours since the strike began.
Central London, 10 minutes before the strike begins and the last call-out, just a fire alarm in Kensington. Then firefighters in Knightsbridge, in the heart of the capital, walk out, closing the doors behind them, and the picket lines return. The strikers foresee a long dispute.
We were advised to be prepared for a long, hard strike.
These firefighters who've just gone on strike are keenly aware of the importance of public opinion, and they know that will be put to the test when lives are at stake.
Some horns blew in support, and most of the men here said they would respond if lives were in danger.
What's the nearest station, please?
It was commuters who first felt the effects of the strike. 19 deep-level tube stations closed, and tonight some underground staff refused to work because of concerns about safety. One line was suspended, another closed, and there have been long delays.
Totally unexpected. I didn't realise this one was shutting too.
Then an hour after the strike began, armed troops halted the traffic in West London. A Green Goddess answered an emergency, but it took 7 minutes to leave after receiving the call, and it moved slowly through the traffic, underlining what a basic service this is. They investigated reports of a chip pan fire, but it proved a false alarm. In the Midlands, just before the strike began, a Green Goddess had to be towed back to base. These are 50-year-old vehicles, and they're often unreliable. In Belfast, Goddesses painted non-military yellow were deployed with armed escorts. Here they investigated a suspected chemical spill at a leisure centre. Most of the call-outs this evening have been for minor incidents or false alarms, like here in Birmingham. But on average, it's taking twice as long to attend emergencies. In Newtown in mid-Wales, a 76-year-old woman died in a house fire an hour after the strike began. Smoke had filled the building. Some reports say firefighters left their picket line to try and help. It was a reminder of what is at stake in this dispute. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News.
So how are the emergency control rooms coping in the first few hours of the strike? Ben Brown is in Liverpool, a city well used to fire disputes. Ben.
Yes, Peter, as you can see, the pickets behind me are trying to keep warm tonight. Their mood is extremely angry and extremely determined. Now, in Liverpool in recent years, there have been several local strikes by the firefighters here over local issues, but it does mean that the fire authorities on Merseyside have got quite a lot of experience in trying to provide emergency cover.
Reference is 343.
If you dial 999 for a fire tonight, this is where they'll route your call. Special emergency control rooms like this one here in Liverpool, manned by the military and the police. Can they cope? Well, we're about to find out.
We are providing a very basic of fire cover that actually will meet the needs for most incidents, the skip going on fire, rubbish fires, bits and pieces. We'll be able to deal with those things. A major fire is a challenge to a professional full-time fire service, and clearly it will be an enormous challenge to these officers today.
So what sort of equipment have the armed forces got for their role as the country's stand-in fire brigade? Today they showed us some of it, when they could get it started, that is. There's cutting gear like this for rescuing people from car crashes, and special protective suits in case of a major chemical incident, along with mobile showers for instant decontamination. And in Liverpool tonight, the Army's Green Goddesses have gone into action. We followed this one to an emergency call. It was agonisingly slow, travelling at just 30 miles an hour. When the Green Goddess finally got to the scene, a burning car, the crew couldn't manage to get any water into their hose. For about 20 minutes, not a drop came out, and local youths simply laughed at them. If this had been a house fire, the consequences could have been fatal. Well, as you can see, the fire here is still burning fiercely. No one's life is actually in danger, but this has not been a very good start for the Green Goddesses here in Liverpool. Eventually, this unfortunate crew did find a nearby water hydrant. Even then, they had trouble making their hose long enough to stretch to the fire. Their equipment is antiquated, and their training has been just a few weeks. For better or worse, from now on, our lives are in their hands. Well, Peter, the striking firefighters here say they're not surprised by the rather farcical scenes we've witnessed tonight. They say these Green Goddesses wouldn't even pass their MOT and that they belong in a museum.
And Ben, how do the military there, many of whom will have had no knowledge of this sort of procedure at all, how do they think they're getting on?
Well, so far tonight, both the military and the police here on Merseyside, at least, say it's been a pretty smooth transition, although, as you've seen, that's not our experience. But they say they've had around 25 incidents that they've had to deal with. But so far, these have all been pretty minor incidents, rubbish fires, skip fires, car fires. Nothing really like a house fire or a factory fire that could present them with a really major challenge.
Ben, thank you. And Rory Cellan-Jones is at Chelsea Barracks, one of the major deployment centres for Green Goddesses in London. Rory, on the evidence so far, how overall is Britain's makeshift fire service coping?
I think it's going reasonably smoothly so far, Peter. Here at Chelsea Barracks, all the Green Goddesses have been out on various calls. They're saying it's a pretty average night in London, although they've had an awful lot of hoax calls, which they're a bit worried about. Of course, as Ben was saying, they haven't really been tested. Nowhere in Britain so far have we heard reports of a really major incident. So that's when the big test will come. But they seem pretty confident that they're coping reasonably well.
Now, if there's no early improved offer, and so far we just have a 48-hour strike, how do you see this dispute developing?
Well, today we had more talks between John Prescott and Andy Gilchrist, as we were seeing earlier. Now, after those talks, at the end of the evening, Mr. Prescott was indicating there was a possibility of more money in 2004, quite a long way off. Mr. Gilchrist, asked to respond to that tonight, said, well, he's not told me about any of that. The two sides still don't seem to be talking the same language. They're an awful long way apart. The government is determined, really, to stick to the line, to say we won't fund an inflationary pay award. So it is difficult to see anything being sorted out before the end of next week, when that 8-day strike is due.
Rory Cellan-Jones, thank you. And there'll be round-the-clock coverage of the firefighters' strike and its consequences on BBC News 24. And now the rest of tonight's news. Iraq has delivered
in Scotland, but the military Green Goddesses are being plagued with a flood of hoax calls. In Strathclyde alone, just 20 out of the 260 calls were genuine. The Army says lives are being put at risk. Here's our chief reporter, David Cowan.
The soldiers called out to deal with this bonfire in Edinburgh found themselves struggling with the equipment, although they managed to put it out in the end. Scotland's first fire strike in 25 years started with dozens of such minor call-outs and a flood of hoaxes. Malicious calls can cost lives when the real fire service is working. Their impact tonight could be disastrous. The firefighters walked out at 6, their mood defiant.
We've been put in a corner. We want a professional pay for a professional job. I'm a command officer who goes to incidents and supports the firefighters on the ground. £21,500 when I'm asking them to go into a building or to cut people out of a car, it's just not good enough.
Well, we've exhausted every avenue we possibly can to avoid it. And on Monday there was a bombshell dropped called the Bain Report, which basically blew out all our negotiations. And the employers then the following day gave us a really derisory offer, and it's left us with no other option.
Scotland's Justice Minister made a statement to the Scottish Parliament an hour after the strike started.
I can only urge the Fire Brigade Union to call off their industrial action and to commit themselves to engaging with the independent review. It is vital that all sides continue constructive dialogue to reach a settlement which is fair to firefighters and to the public whom they serve.
A short time ago, soldiers wearing breathing apparatus had to help a family from their home in Muir House in Edinburgh after a fire in a neighbouring flat. It's not yet known if any of them required hospital treatment.
Appeal
Fire has closed the West Coast main line at Rutherglen on the outskirts of Glasgow. 2 of the Army's Green Goddess fire engines tackled the blaze, which is now out. The rail line is expected to stay closed for 24 hours. It's the most serious incident in Scotland since the fire brigade strike began. Police say many of the calls they're receiving are hoaxes. Of almost 260 calls in Strathclyde, only 20 were genuine. David Calder reports.
The fire broke out in a derelict garage, which is very close to the railway. Railtrack decided to close the line, which carries both Virgin and ScotRail sleeper services to London and local suburban services. ScotRail also says that because of a power surge caused by the fire, signals are out of action on the Argyll line. 2 of the Army's Green Goddesses are at the scene trying to control the fire. It's by far the most serious incident this evening. Police are warning they'll come down hard on hoax callers. In the Strathclyde Force area alone, 259 calls were made in the first 2 hours of the strike. The majority were malicious. Scotland's 6,000 firefighters walked out on a 48-hour strike at 6 o'clock this evening. Most say they didn't want to take the action.
I think I can talk for every firefighter throughout the UK when I say that. As I say, it's a course of action none of us want to take, but we feel we have no other option left.
We feel we've been cornered, been pushed into this position, simply because the government and the employers simply will not negotiate with us.
The Deputy First Minister, Jim Wallace, made a statement in Parliament this evening. He told MSPs that contingency plans were in place and Scotland was ready.
Whilst we have never claimed that the contingency arrangements can replicate fully the cover provided by the regular fire service, the Ministry of Defence personnel have been preparing and training for their role during the strike. They are providing emergency cover, and in doing so their priority will be to save life.
However, ministers are closely monitoring the situation to see how the military and police are coping.
After 25 years...
Putting people's lives at risk, that really is the last thing I'd ever want to do. My family's at home and there's no fire cover for them either. Why would we take that chance? And it really was a last resort. It's not something any of us are taking lightly.
6 o'clock walkout's been done. The hardest moment of my life. None of us want to be out there. There's millions of pounds of equipment in our plant rooms all around the country. There's all that experience of firemen outside the doors, and none of us should be out there. We should be back in here, getting a fair pay, not standing out there, and people out there just waiting for a fire incident to come out, and it won't be coming.
That's it tonight. There's more news.
Hello and welcome to the BBC's News at 1 o'clock. Britain's first nationwide firefighter strike for 25 years is 19 hours old. 3 people died in separate house fires overnight. Downing Street says that if next week's planned 8-day strike goes ahead, it will be a different ballgame, suggesting that the government would look at troops being allowed to use fire engines instead of Green Goddesses. And within the past hour, the Deputy Prime Minister, John Prescott, told MPs the government will do what it has to do to protect the public. This 48-hour strike continues until 6 p.m. tomorrow. The 3 fatal fires were in Burnley, Newtown in Mid-Wales and Halesowen. The large number of hoax calls has raised concerns. Across Scotland, there was 86 hoaxes last night. That's 4 times more than normal. And in the West Midlands, there were 31 hoax calls, 3 times higher than normal. Our industry correspondent, Rory Kethlen-Jones, assesses the impact of the strike.
19 hours into the firefighters' strike, and across the country, their replacements from the armed forces are seeing plenty of action. At Dingle in Liverpool, the army was called this morning to a fire in an empty building. The limitations of their equipment are plain, but at the moment they seem to be coping. In Huntingdon, RAF personnel dealt with a fire in a car beneath a block of flats. Residents had to be evacuated from the building, which is just 500 yards from the nearest fire station. The striking firefighters say the RAF did its best, but they'd have moved faster.
This is now the reality of the fire service strike. A car fire to us is bread and butter work. That would have been out and dealt with within minutes.
The RAF said the main aim had been to avoid fatalities, and it was pleased with its work.
The adrenaline goes quite well when you get the real flames arriving. The crews cope very well.
Many of them did last night at various incidents, in saying that I applauded them.
The man leading the strike was in Edinburgh. As Andy Gilchrist continued a tour of the UK, his union was angered at what it describes as abuse from the government and media.
We do this against a background. We'll be called murderers, criminals, wretched by this government.
The media were asked to leave this rally of firefighters. Afterwards, the union's leader insisted he wasn't trying to take on the government.
Well, this has never been an issue for me or indeed the union, as to my knowledge, about taking on Mr Blair, the Cabinet, the government, or indeed the New Labour Party. Simple fact is, we've got a legitimate pay dispute.
Firefighters have left picket lines to attend life-threatening incidents like this one at Newtown in Powys. But neither they nor the army, who were quickly on the scene, were able to save a 73-year-old woman whose home had caught fire.
In a close community like this, they probably knew the lady, and they would have felt terrible if they hadn't reacted to the call.
Pressure is mounting on ministers to give the troops access to standard fire engines. This morning, the government indicated that if next week's planned 8-day strike goes ahead, that might be an option. Rory Catlin-Jones, BBC News.
Scotland's senior law officer has promised to fast-track the prosecutions of hoax callers during the strike. Scotland was hardest hit, but there was a massive increase in hoax calls across Britain, with some areas reporting 3 or 4 times the normal number of malicious calls. Our Scotland correspondent Andrew Castle reports on an unexpected problem for the hard-pressed armed forces.
In the Command and Coordination Centre for Scotland, they've been monitoring the rising number of hoax emergency calls with a mixture of alarm and anger. So far, there have been 86 confirmed hoax call-outs since the fire strike began, more than half of them in the Strathclyde area and many more than the normal rate over a 24-hour period. The police are doing their best to weed out the malicious calls, but they're at a loss to explain why people are making them.
I have no idea what motivates that sort of reckless, irresponsible action on their part. They're putting lives at risk. Indeed, they're putting their own lives at risk. They're putting the lives of their friends and family and those close to them at risk, and it is abhorrent, to say the very least.
The worry is that valuable time getting to real fires like this one in Rutherglen near Glasgow could be lost, a real concern among those now manning the Green Goddesses.
We would hate to be sent in the wrong direction to deal with a hoax call and then find that somebody else's life is put at risk. It's particularly galling when we are stretched. We're capable firefighters, but we don't have all the resources that the local authority fire brigade have, and consequently we can't respond to everything.
When resources are spread so thinly, there are just 110 of these Green Goddesses covering the whole of Scotland. Hoax calls are the last thing the authorities need. The Scottish Executive said that those suspected of making malicious calls will be fast-tracked through the legal system, prosecuted and severely dealt with. Andrew Castle, BBC News, at the Central Scotland Command Centre in Stirling.
We can get the latest now live from our correspondents. Kevin Bouquet is on a picket line with striking firefighters in Burnley. And Robert Hall is with the Armed Forces providing fire cover for the West Midlands. First, Kevin in Burnley.
Well, Anna, this picket line, like hundreds of others around the country, has been manned continuously since the strike began. Now, last night in Burnley, there was an incident, a fire, in which an elderly man died. And it was an incident which has raised questions about how good a service the army and the police are able to provide. At around 10 o'clock last night, neighbours raised the alarm when they smelt smoke from this terraced house. There was an elderly man inside. 6 minutes later, a Green Goddess arrived. Residents said the police spent at least 3 minutes trying to force the door. One of the neighbours said he had to help.
Going at the door handle, you've no chance of getting it, so you split the door casing, it opens the lock, then you can jemmy it and you can kick it in. So it's easier for you to get in, but they were hacking at the door handle, which you'd have been there another 10-20 minutes.
The 83-year-old man was brought out of the house by soldiers. He was still alive. The army say they administered first aid, but neighbours say he received no artificial respiration from either the police or the soldiers. He was given mouth-to-mouth resuscitation by a neighbour. These are the firefighters of White Watch who would have attended the fire. They say they'd have broken down the door within 30 seconds and would have administered artificial respiration themselves. And they say that if they'd been asked to attend last night, they would have done, despite the strike.
If we'd have known that there was somebody in a house in distress, we would have made an attendance. And I don't think I'm alone in saying that. Don't think that I'm the only station commander that's thinking in this way. Across the country, we know that the public aren't our enemies. It's the radical employers that are trying to destruct the fire service.
The elderly man was taken to Burnley General Hospital, where he later died. Well, the Army have just told us that they do have equipment for breaking down doors on burning buildings. They say it was an Army hammer last night which eventually broke down the door. Now, nobody is suggesting that if the firefighters had been working normally, this unfortunate man would have survived, but certainly this has been an incident which has highlighted some of the safety issues raised by the firefighters' strike. Now, Robert Hall has been taking a closer look at how the armed forces have been coping over this first day of the firefighters' strike. He's at an Army depot at Oldbury in the West Midlands. Robert.
Well, the skies are clearing here after what has been a relatively quiet night over the West Midlands. It's one of the biggest fire areas outside London, but the number of calls are down, and we'll be looking at that in a moment. We've spent time with the Welsh Guards and the Royal Regiment of Wales to see how their night has gone. They'd been apprehensive but determined to do their best. This morning, the soldiers in the front line of Operation Fresco were increasingly confident that their training would hold up under pressure. In the first 12 hours of the strike, the emergency control room had received over 200 999 calls, but most had been dealt with by other services. The Army crews responding to just 28. More pressure! And those proved easily within their capabilities. Small incidents like this car fire, quickly handled, but an effective test of the way that the Green Goddesses are being mobilised. There are question marks over their reaction times. 86-year-old Evan Davis died in a fire at these flats half a mile from his local fire station. The Army had to travel from up to 7 miles away, but residents said they had done all they could.
I don't think they could have done any more than they did last night. I really admire how quickly everything arrived, and everybody was marvellous.
So far, public awareness has helped keep the number of calls down, but with 24 hours still to go, these crews know they may yet face the unexpected. I think we've been following these crews all night, and I have to say that we've seen no great operational difficulties. One Green Goddess broke down early in the evening, was repaired and back on the road within an hour or so. However, I think it's also important to stress, and I mentioned it in the report there, that there is an increase in public awareness. There are motorway signs here warning drivers, for example, to take it easy because of the firefighters' strike. Everybody hopes that that public awareness will stay as it is. But the firefighters here and at the other TA centres across the West Midlands are fully aware that the true test may yet lie ahead. Anna.
Robert in Oldbury and Kevin in Burnley, thank you both very much indeed. In a strong speech to the Commons within the past hour, John Prescott said there's still no fully agreed formula with the Fire Brigades Union on how to handle what he called major incidents. And he warned of a tougher government stance if the strikes continue.
Once this 48-hour strike is over, we will then face an 8-day strike, yet to be confirmed. The government may have to review many of the issues which up to now have been kept off the table. We have bent over backwards to be fair and reasonable.
Our political correspondent Mark Mardell is in Downing Street. Mark, government language is clearly getting tougher. They're talking about the possibility of using red fire engines. That would mean crossing picket lines. What's all this mean?
Well, there's no doubt there is a tougher language, and it will herald a tougher attitude if the firefighters don't get back into talks and if they do go ahead with that 8-day strike. The Prime Minister's spokesman said that it would be entering different territory, different ball game if they did go ahead with that strike, than next week's Friday's 8-day strike. And he was specifically answering a question about whether or not troops would use these red fire engines, the normal red fire engines. Now, the government's been quite frank about that. In the past, they've worried that because they were in talks with the firefighters, it would simply be provocative to go into the fire stations and take them away. That reason has now gone. John Prescott is still saying there are operational difficulties. It does take time to train on these things, but it seems if next week's longer strike goes ahead, they will go into fire stations and take these red engines and use them.
Well, in spite of the tough talking by John Prescott this morning, the talks are still going on. Is there any hope of a settlement?
I think it's difficult to see, but I wouldn't be that surprised if there were some more talks. There's no doubt the government very, very clearly wants them to get into new negotiations. There were hints last night that there might be a bit more money in the third year on offer. But the talks are also about cover in the event of a catastrophe. And John Prescott was very disappointed that that hadn't been signed up to.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. Well, we'll have more on the firefighter strike later in the programme.
In coming to terms with the first firefighters' strike in 25 years. The leader of the Fire Brigades Union is addressing striking Scottish staff against a backdrop of a substantial increase in the number of hoax calls plaguing the stand-in fire service. Well, our reporter Alan Mackay joins us from the second big meeting today at Glasgow's Kelvin Hall. Alan.
Yes, James, well, clearly any strike that affects public services, the question of how the public react to that is going to be crucial, but I think that's especially true in the firefighters' dispute where, as we've already seen, tragically lives are at risk, and that's why rallies like the one going on in the Kelvin Hall in Glasgow are crucial to the union leadership to assess how their membership are feeling and how keen they are for the leadership to go back to the negotiating table. But perhaps inevitably the focus so far has been on how the military have coped with what's been thrown at them in the first few hours of the strike.
Fire at a derelict four-storey block in Glasgow's Pollock housing scheme becomes one of the first major incidents for Scottish servicemen to tackle. Nearby residents are told to leave their homes.
I think around about 40 minutes it took to come, maybe a wee bit more. And it was a bottom flat, it was on fire. And by the time the Green Goddess came, it was going up to the third.
Another derelict flat in the Burmulloch scheme was left to burn overnight after military personnel gave up trying to tackle the blaze. The infamous 50-year-old Green Goddesses showed their age in Edinburgh as they headed slowly to another blaze at a derelict building. At one stage, a fire at a Rutherglen garage held up services on the nearby West Coast rail line, but they were quickly back to normal. Striking firefighters give their UK union leader a rousing reception at an Edinburgh rally. Newspapers appearing to turn against the pay demand with negative headlines were blamed for cameras being quickly ejected. Union officials say the publicity won't prevent them seeking a way out.
Simple fact is we've got a legitimate pay dispute for people who get poor pay at the moment, and what we'd say to the government is you've had 6 years to address the issue of public sector pay.
Scottish ministers haven't entered the emergency planning room at St Andrew's House since the fuel blockades of 2 years ago. After a night of incidents and tragic events elsewhere in the UK, the union was urged to get back to talks.
Employers have indicated their willingness to continue negotiations. I very much hope that once this 48-hour strike is over, that the Fire Brigade Union will be prepared to return to the negotiating table. That's the place where this issue is going to be resolved.
There's no doubt in firefighters' minds that their campaign needs public support. That's why they'll be watching how that support goes up or down as their union leaders try to find a satisfactory outcome.
So, Alan, we're one day into the strike now. What's the picture across Scotland?
Well, thankfully, the nature of the fire so far in Scotland means that lives have not been put at risk. I think the picture will become clearer after the 48 hours have come to an end. I think one issue that is concerning the military is the number of hoax calls, around 100 so far, and sources at the military HQ in Stirling have been telling us this morning that that is hampering the operation. Of course, it has to be said that you do get hoax calls to the normal fire service outside of a strike, so this is nothing new.
Nonetheless, ministers and indeed the police are talking tough on what's going to happen now with the hoaxers.
Well, that's exactly right. I think the Lord Advocate has said this morning that he's encouraging police to arrest where appropriate, and that's been confirmed by police commanders involved in this operation as well. And that the Lord Advocate has said that the prosecution service will have his full support if they can try to get cases to court quickly. In fact, just to confirm that fast-tracking approach, already one man from Beargowrie has been before the court this morning after making 3 malicious calls to the control centre in Dundee within 10 minutes of the strike starting last night, and the Justice of the Peace told him his actions were very reprehensible and could have put lives at risk. He's been bailed and will be sentenced in 4 weeks' time.
Alan Mackay, thanks very much indeed. An Aberdeenshire man who abused and killed his partner's baby girl.
This evening, and as striking firefighters look on, their replacements take on one of their biggest challenges so far. A warehouse full of fireworks is ablaze, and 4 green goddesses are at the scene. The firefighters came to offer help if anyone was trapped, but with just property at risk, they're letting the armed forces cope as best they can. Earlier in the day, a road accident in Leeds and a driver is trapped in his car. Just the kind of incident where firefighters' expertise is vital. But today it was the army which had to answer the call. For an hour, the troops tried to cut a man free. Then striking firefighters came to help. The army says it was already coping well. The firefighters' version is different.
My expertise and knowledge, and that of the crew that came with me, was able, utilising the same tools and equipment that they were using, to release that casualty within 5 minutes of us arriving on the scene.
In Burnley, firefighters insisted they would have come to this fatal house fire if they'd been called. An elderly man was brought out.
Well, Hugh, it's still burning away, this 4-storey building. There were, as you said, fireworks stored inside and acetylene cylinders too. So the army are very worried about it. They're worried that it might spread. They're trying to bring it under control some 2 or 3 hours after it started. Now, what's bizarre about this fire is that it started right opposite the Manchester Central Fire Station, where there were lots of striking firefighters manning the picket line. Now, they spotted the fire. They raised the alarm by dialing 999 on their mobile phone. They then briefly interrupted their strike, running over the road into the burning building. They pulled out a man who was in there and possibly saved his life. One of the firefighters, one of the pickets, was actually injured in the process. And then the firefighters, having decided that nobody else was at risk in the building, went back on strike, went back onto the picket line and left it to the soldiers. There's about 30 soldiers from 4 Green Goddesses still struggling to put out the fire, and the pickets say it's one of the most depressing days of their life to be standing at their fire station on the picket line watching these soldiers trying to put out the fire.
All right, Ben, for that update in Manchester, thank you very much. So, at the end of day one, as we look across the country, how have the stand-in firefighters been coping? Fergus has been looking at the facts and figures. He's with me now. What have you found out, Fergus?
Well, Hugh, it's obviously not been easy for the military to cope and step into the shoes of more than 50,000 trained firefighters. The strike is now 24 hours old, another 24 to go. Let's take a look around the country. Well, this is Cardiff Central Fire Station, where you can see the firefighters are manning the picket line just as colleagues are doing across the UK. And this is live at the West End Station in Newcastle, and the red fire engines are standing idle there as they are in so many other fire stations. So how busy have the Green Goddesses been? Well, there are no national figures yet, but to give you an idea, we've looked at one area, Avon and Somerset. Now, there are 17 ageing Green Goddesses covering this area of the southwest. They're replacing 77 modern fire engines, but there are still a few of those that are operating outside the Bristol area. 12 are working normally, manned by part-time, what's known as retained firefighters, and it's the same in many rural areas. It's thankfully been an unusually quiet 24 hours, just 21 fire call-outs. The military told us that in Bristol, they've been getting to most incidents in well under 10 minutes. So has today changed your opinion of the strike? Well, here's a quick snapshot from across the UK.
I think they deserve more money, and I think this is the only way they're going to get more money is by doing what they're doing. But I feel ashamed if anyone does have a fire or anything, it's going to be a nightmare.
Thousands of people are trying to become firemen. Therefore, the market forces would dictate why give them a rise. There's loads of people who'd love to be firemen.
Yes, I do think that they should not necessarily strike. No, I don't believe that. But I think that they should get quite a lot more money.
Well, I don't like strikes at all.
But it's making a point.
They could have come to a better arrangement by going round the table and talking more.
Now, the knock-on effects of the strike have been pretty limited so far. In London, 22 of the deepest underground stations have been closed for safety reasons. There have also been serious delays, with around 60 tube trains not running because drivers say it's just too dangerous during the strike. With nearly 60 flood alerts, it's not fire but water, which is the worry for many in Devon and Cornwall. It's been made worse because there are no firefighters to pump water out of the buildings. Now, in the last hour, we've heard of firefighters
leaving the picket lines in Glasgow to help a man trapped under fallen debris. Unfortunately, he died. We'll bring you more news on that as soon as we get it. Hugh.
All right, Fergus, thanks very much. Well, John Prescott, the Deputy Prime Minister, was saying earlier today that there was still...
He has described the dozens of people who made hoax calls during the first hours of the fire strike. There was a huge rise in the number of hoaxes, especially in Strathclyde. And tonight, malicious callers have been told if they're caught, they'll be dealt with quickly and could be sent to prison. In a moment, we'll join Alan Mackay, who's on a firefighters' picket line in Falkirk. But first, David Henderson on the hoaxers who are putting lives at risk.
A green goddess answering an emergency call late last night, but police now say it was a hoax.
Hello, I wanted to send the fire brigade out, please, into Hugginfield in Glasgow. Whereabouts in Hugginfield? Just up next to the Esso station. What's the problem there? There's a car on fire.
There's been a surge of calls like this since the fire strike began. Normally, there'd be about 12 each day, but in Strathclyde alone, there were 49 in just 6 hours.
I have no idea what motivates that sort of reckless, irresponsible action on their part. They're putting lives at risk. Indeed, they're putting their own lives at risk. They're putting the lives of their friends and family and those close to them at risk.
At Westminster, one Glasgow MP expressed his outrage.
Can I say to my old friend how disgusted and ashamed I am as a Strathclyde MP of those 300 hoax callers yesterday. And as they say in Glasgow, they are nothing but scum and should be treated as such.
A hoax phone call takes just seconds to make, but each one wastes precious time and can lead to a loss of life. The authorities are seriously concerned about the scale of the problem. Now they're promising a clampdown.
I've also given instructions to Procurator Fiscals that all such reports from the police have to be treated very seriously indeed and given priority in the system.
So far, only one Scot has been charged with making malicious phone calls. He's a 51-year-old man from Perth. Experts say most hoax callers are much younger.
I wouldn't really expect it in an older age group who've perhaps got a bit more foresight and a bit more imagination, or have maybe even experienced a fire or seen it before.
At this office in Dundee, British Telecom staff are waging a high-tech war against the hoaxers.
Under the terms and conditions of BT's contract, we can't ultimately disconnect someone's telephone service for making hoax or inappropriate 999 calls.
Tonight, the armed forces are again stretched to breaking point.
What's your name? John. What's your address? I'll tell you.
How long till time wasters like these cost lives? David Henderson, reporting Scotland, Glasgow.
So, 24 hours into the strike, how do firefighters view the effect of their action, both on safety and on public support? Well, Alan Mackay's been gauging reaction. He's at a fire picket line in Falkirk. Alan.
Well, Jackie, there's certainly no doubt in the firefighters' minds here in Falkirk, at least, that public support is not on the wane, contrary to what members of the government may be saying. As far as the capabilities of the Green Goddess as well, in the last few minutes here in Falkirk, a fire appliance actually left, driven by striking firemen, staffed by striking firemen, went to a house fire in Denny where the men here had heard that a lady was in danger. She was helped out of the house and is now safe and well, and in fact the Central Scotland Fire Appliance got there before the Green Goddess. As you said, we're 24 hours into the stoppage, and now all 2,000 of the military personnel in Scotland have had a taste of frontline action, and clearly the focus throughout that 24 hours is in how they coped in this early period of the strike.
Fire breaks out at a derelict 4-storey block in Glasgow's Pollock housing scheme. It's the first major incident tackled by Scottish servicemen. No one is hurt, but nearby residents have already left their homes before the Green Goddesses arrive.
I think around about 40 minutes it took to come, maybe a wee bit more. And it was a bottom flat, it was on fire, and by the time the Green Goddess came, it was going up to the 3rd.
Another derelict flat in the Barmulla scheme is left to burn overnight after military personnel give up the fight, trying to douse the flames. The infamous 50-year-old machines start to show their age in Edinburgh as they head for another blaze at a derelict building.
Would have got them in no time. And for these stand-ins, training still has to take place on the job.
With one line, yeah, over the rest of the host, just feed over the wall, get them over there, give you a hand.
This house in Burnley, the site of one of the fires.
Technology on board the Green Goddesses. So just how easy is it going to be to train them to operate the state-of-the-art fire trucks? Chris Choi has been learning firsthand the demands of modern firefighter training.
The difference between life and death. Today it was revealed that soldiers will get modern fire engines for the first time. Right now they'll be used for training, but many want the government to unlock this equipment to save lives on strike days. Already that's hardened the mood of this industrial action.
If they want to inflame the situation, they could do no worse than that. I mean, it wouldn't be an 8-day strike, it would probably be a total walkout.
A lot of people think that these should be out on the streets saving lives on strike days.
It's going to cause a massive uproar if the soldiers was to come in here. They're not qualified to use these machines.
Behind the picket lines today, I got a taste of what's involved in firefighter training.
That's obviously used for cutting people out of things like car accidents and stuff like that, which invariably is a very intricate and complex operation.
A hunk of firefighting hardware like that will set you back anything up to £150,000. And many people think the soldiers should be using those instead of the creaky old Green Goddesses. But as I found out, having one of these is not the same as having the skills to use it. It takes 4 years to fully qualify as a firefighter, including a probation period. It takes 17 weeks to go through basic training. Troops can't do that for imminent strike cover. Professional firefighters spend 4 weeks just learning how to use breathing apparatus, and it takes 2 weeks to use this cutting gear for car rescues. But is all that really essential for using this equipment? We asked one of the companies that sells it.
You would need years of experience, really, to understand and to know how to use the equipment safely for yourself and, of course, the casualty as well.
Government can't give these service personnel that experience, but can, and yet may, give them better equipment. Chris Choi, ITV News.
Well, in case anyone had forgotten just how high the stakes...
Manchester is still burning tonight, a dramatic illustration of the problems caused by the firefighters' strike. Teams of soldiers have been fighting the blaze for more than 6 hours now, and at one stage they were joined by firefighters who left their picket lines to assist. The explosions and the showers of flame have now died away, but it's feared that the warehouse could collapse. Harry Smith is at the scene for us tonight. Harry?
For the Green Goddess crews still working here beside me, this was undoubtedly their toughest test yet. A fire in a warehouse partly used to store fireworks. On a day when the fire service was on strike, it was an explosive mixture which produced a spectacular blaze. This amateur video captures the moment when it all went off. Striking firemen from a station just a few hundred yards away were among the first on the scene and were able to help one man out of the building. Minutes later, the Green Goddesses were there, their crews pouring water onto a blaze which looked as if it was raging out of control. As smoke billowed over a large part of central Manchester, surrounding buildings in this mainly industrial area were evacuated. More than 100 people had to be moved. As darkness fell, the military firefighters were still battling the flames, a spectacular display lighting up the sky. Among the spectators, the striking firefighters who'd returned to their picket lines. One needed hospital treatment after going into the burning building.
As soon as you know it's person's reported, your instincts of being trained as a firefighter take over. So we did what we trained to do.
A total of 33 military personnel fought the blaze, and despite their limited training and outdated equipment, they have now managed to bring the flames under control.
This is pretty much a major incident, and it has been a challenge, but as I've said, the boys have really cracked on and done the job in a very professional and efficient manner.
For their toughest job yet, the Green Goddess crews can count themselves lucky. This is not a residential area, and there was no immediate threat to life. With this dispute set to drag on, they may not be so lucky next time.
That blaze at the warehouse ends a busy 28 hours for the Green Goddesses and their crews. There are still 20 hours to go until the firefighters return to work, and from all indications, it could be another busy night. In the first 24 hours of the strike, soldiers responded to some 1,500 calls across the country. It's thought that as many as a quarter were hoaxes or false alarms. So far, 3 pensioners have died in fires in their own homes. At Newtown in Wales, 73-year-old Violet Davis. At Burnley in Lancashire, 83-year-old Alan Smith. And at Halesowen in the West Midlands, 86-year-old Evan Davis. With the possibility of a lengthy dispute tonight, the government seems prepared to take a tougher line. ITV News has learned that the government has access to over 100 red fire engines, some from the Fire Training College, and it hasn't ruled out taking over firefighters' equipment. Our political editor Nick Robinson has the latest.
It could be another long night for Britain's stand-in fire crews. Perhaps not what these guys joined the RAF to do, but with the help of part-time firefighters, they did rescue 2 people from this country house near Hay-on-Wye. It's been a lively night too for the strike leader, who's been touring the country declaring his defiance.
It's interesting when I'm being pressed at the moment by some about what arrangements there should be during this strike periods. You know, when I reflect, you know, we actually started this process of negotiation on May the 28th. Perhaps they might have made a call then about safety during periods of strike action.
John Prescott's reply, it's no more Mr. Nice Guy.
We have bent over backwards to be fair and reasonable.
That might be about to end.
We have been met with action that is wrong, unjustified and put lives at risk. Faced with this, the government will do what we have to do to protect the public. I say talk, don't walk.
More than a hint of a threat there. The Tories want to know why red engines are standing idle whilst troops are struggling with equipment that's decades out of date.
Can he reassure the House that the real reason for keeping life-saving equipment under union lock and key is not a misplaced sympathy for the sanctity of the picket line?
It's the sanctity of life that governs me.
What will that mean in practice, though? He didn't say. Troops are now being trained to use red engines. 18 were driven away from here, the National Fire Training College, in the dead of last night. 100 more being held in reserve may soon be accessible. Crossing picket lines to get even more could produce ugly confrontations and embarrassment for a Labour government. But for now, though, it's come to this. A fire in a block of flats in Glasgow. Substitute firefighters doing their best and a hose that simply won't reach its target. Nick Robinson, ITV News, Westminster.
Nick, talk to us about tactics. What are they from the government's point of view tonight?
Absolutely simple, Trevor. To prove that this government isn't soft. To prove that this government isn't fearful of the sort of confrontation that the Tories had with the miners. To prove, in other words, that there's no tactic that this government won't pursue in order to protect public safety. Now, who are they trying to convince? The Firemen's Union, of course, the members too, to convince them that it's not worth another 8-day strike, but of course also the public, still with memories of how the last Labour government was brought down by union confrontations, and this government is determined that that won't happen again.
Now, Nick, there is talk about using all these fire engines. Will that do the trick?
Well, no, ministers are telling me it won't do the trick, because in all the talk about whether there's 15 here or 100 there, people forget you need trained staff to drive those fire engines and to use the appliances too. Who are they? Well, they're troops, of course. And on the eve of a possible war in Iraq, let's be honest, Trevor, there's not exactly that many troops to go round. So even if they will risk confrontation and cross picket lines, even if the troops can be trained, there may not simply be the numbers that the Ministry of Defence are willing to release.
Nick Robinson, thank you. And firefighters...
They moved, but they moved slowly, getting there as fast as they could, but holding up the traffic behind. A car fire on waste ground was one of the first calls, but they couldn't get in close enough to fight it.
I had a bit of problem getting up here, but now we're up here, we've just put the vehicle out with the 2 hoses, reels from the side of the vehicle.
In the morning, they were still at it, answering calls from their command centre, but plagued by the time wasters.
When it's a genuine call, they stay on the line to give lots more detail.
That's right. Here too, the police will be pursuing the hoaxers. By mid-afternoon, the pattern was becoming familiar.
This is fairly typical of the incidents the Green Goddesses have had to deal with here in Sheffield. An abandoned car which has been set fire on wasteland. It's time-consuming, and calls like this are keeping the whole service stretched to the limit.
On the picket line, they're getting support, and while the hours are dragging, morale is high.
We've had over £500 in 24 hours. We've got a load of food being given to us. So yeah, we're really encouraged by what we're seeing. Every third car is sounding its horns at us.
What have you learned by standing on this picket line?
We learnt a lot actually, because I was on the last strike and it's nothing like it was before, nothing at all. It's more camaraderie, and now we're more positive on what we're aiming for.
They stay determined, hoping the end will come soon. Tim Rogers, ITV News, Sheffield.
With breakfast in Edinburgh, the papers are hostile. He knows public support is vital, but if the coverage bothers him, he isn't showing it.
It's neither helpful or remotely interesting, to be honest.
On the way to the first picket line, a call from the Deputy Prime Minister.
Cheers, John.
They're still talking to one another, but it's mostly about safety. On pay, there's no meeting of minds.
And thank God we weren't that bloody dark. If we could have sat there and said, all right, we'll sign up to this.
To win, he must keep up morale, and as the dispute goes on, it will become more difficult. So far, they're right behind him.
We put our trust in the man. We gave him the mandate, and you know, he's got difficult. It's hard for him to keep us, you know, 100% and for him.
At the Edinburgh rally, rapturous applause. Andy Gilchrist is one of a new generation of union leaders, more uncompromising, less worried about upsetting a Labour government, and he's a party member. Late morning and it's time to head off for Glasgow. Leading a strike successfully means keeping your nerve, and this man looks cool enough under pressure. But this dispute is like no other. Last night, 3 people died. Did you lose any sleep over any of this?
Certainly. I don't know about lose sleep. I mean, naturally I'm concerned. This is not messing around. This is a serious business we're in.
People's lives.
Indeed. This is a serious service that's provided. This is a serious issue about pay, and we want to get it resolved as speedily as possible.
Yeah. How long are you prepared to go on with this dispute?
Well, I think we go on with this dispute until we can reach a settlement that's satisfactory to our members. And as I say, that's at the moment very much the ball is in the court of the fire service employers and those in government that can assist.
Andy Gilchrist will have been hugely encouraged by the reception that he's got today. Support for this strike is rock solid. But he also knows that in the weeks and months ahead, the pressure on him and his members to settle this dispute is bound to increase. Neil Dixon, BBC News, at the Kelvin Hall in Glasgow.
This was a genuine emergency in Edinburgh last night. 7 people were rescued by the military and treated for smoke inhalation. But the first 6 hours of the strike were dominated by hoaxes. In Strathclyde, 4 out of every 5 calls was malicious. This was one of them.
Hello, how can I help you? Hello, I want to send the fire brigade out, please, to Hoggenfield in Glasgow. What's the problem there? There's a car on fire. A car on fire? Yes, it is. Okay, do you wish to give your name? It's Bill McLaughlin. Bill McLaughlin. Okay, thanks for phoning, sir. Well, I'm going to be next. I'll get some of this quick as we can. Thank you. Okay, right, bye. Right.
There is nothing funny about putting...
The limitations of the equipment all too clear, but the hoaxers were making things worse.
There's a lot of talk about the additional risk posed by green goddesses. Well, that risk pales into insignificance compared to the risk that's added to by hoax calls.
But how is the Army coping with the real thing? This derelict block of flats in Glasgow caught fire last night and was still burning today. 32 neighbouring households had to be evacuated.
I think they believed that they'd actually got it out last night and they'd left it, but it flared up again during the night.
They'd been in Dundee last night straight away, the real firemen would have been here.
The real firefighters were back in action when they left their picket line at York Hill. A man working nearby had become trapped under a load of railway sleepers.
Everybody just responded straight away. It's your first instinct, that's what you're going to do. There's no doubt about that.
The strikers lifted the sleepers off the 55-year-old man and gave him first aid. He was taken to hospital but died later from his injuries. The Army's response to such an incident wasn't tested. They weren't called to the scene.
A man who battered a 13-month-old